everybody to the Out There Summit. It's a brave new digital experiment. I reckon I can influence most things. Apparently I can't influence the pandemic. I've finally given in. And everybody, therefore, is online today. We get to see inside everybody, some of their offices, some of their bedrooms, all sorts of things. It's a probing platform. We have a packed agenda. We've got a participant level that's shooting up quicker than the pandemic rate in the state of Florida, and a remarkable group of people to enjoy a good old discussion around education, training and skills in Greater Western Sydney. As we all know, I think everybody tuning in today, there's nothing more important. No matter how flash the train line, the airport, the skyscrapers, the social housing, anything, if we don't get education right, we're gone. You'll see people progressively reducing. That's our panellists. Give you a quick preview, see how attractive they are now. I promise you they'll all be back. But to kick off the day, where else to start with the acknowledgement of country? And in doing that, I want to introduce Renee Thompson, a remarkable young talented woman from Western Sydney, who is both involved in Kimberwali, the former Aboriginal Centre of Excellence in the old Wayland High, who's the Deputy Chair of Durban Aboriginal Land Council, and is also a member of the Dialogues Generation West, our youth advisory panel. Renee, thank you very much for your time. I see you sitting there resplendent in the Kimberwali Centre there now. I might hand over to you.
Thank you, Chris, for that beautiful introduction. So before we start today, everyone, I would like to pay homage to the warriors, the fighters, the elders and the ancestors on the lands across Western Sydney, the ones who are recognised and the ones we've never heard of. I wish to acknowledge and honour the Darug people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm standing on today. I also pay my deepest respect to Aboriginal people who were forcibly removed, displaced and were resettled in Western Sydney during colonisation and post-settlement. Those who have lived on this land and continue to live in the lands of Western Sydney and the surrounding areas. For it is those who walked, protected, cared and nurtured this land since time immemorial, which has allowed you and I to be able to meet today. I extend my acknowledgement to all Aboriginal people who are joining today and acknowledge Durban Local Aboriginal Land Council as the cultural authority on the lands on which we meet. I want to acknowledge all elders who we are still so lucky to have and those who are no longer with us. My name is Renee Thompson. I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman stemming from 32 acres, a Rambi mission in Cowra, but born and raised in Western Sydney. I'm currently the Partnerships Officer at Kimberwali with Aboriginal Affairs, the Deputy Chairperson of Durban Local Aboriginal Land Council and a new member on Generation West. And I just want to welcome everyone to today's session.
Right, that's marvellous. Thank you very much. Can I add to acknowledgement of country from my mob who came to Western Sydney as involuntary tourists about 220 years ago at the bottom of British ships, to your mob who've looked after the joint for 60,000 years. Thank you very much for that very generous acknowledgement of country. And I echo your comments. Just before we kick off the panel, Renee, and you're going to join us later this morning. I can't wait till Renee's appears to have gone. But Renee will be back to join us in the second session. I really want to appreciate her time and her contribution already she's making in Western Sydney, a remarkable young woman. I wanted to quickly run through the agenda for everybody today. I'm going to be joined in a moment by Professor Peter Shergold, AC, the Chancellor of Western Sydney University, but also involved in a range of other educational reviews at the moment and roles. And we're blessed to have Peter. I had the great pleasure of being asked by Peter to serve on his board at WSU for 8 years, and then the ultimate pleasure to end up as his Pro-Chancellor, and then received last year an honorary doctorate. For a bloke with any degree, it meant a lot more to me than most other people receive an honorary doctorate from Western Sydney University. And I'm going to talk to Peter in a second, but in advance of that, just for everybody to remind you, we've got a tremendous session. After we speak to Peter, we've got a panel session that will be moderated by Andy Marks from Western Sydney Uni, together with Amy Brown from Department of Premier and Cabinet, Stephen Forby, the Managing Director of TAFE, Professor Stephen Garton, the Senior Deputy VC and the presumptive next VC of University of Sydney when with the change at the end of the year. Anthony Manning, our main sponsor. I'm particularly delighted Anthony's with us in school infrastructure and so proud of that remarkable new vertical building, the Arthur Phillip High in Parramatta. school I used to play against sport every Tuesday, and they were tough buggers on the rugby league field, let me tell you. And Greg Whitby, the ever controversial, wonderfully interesting head of Catholic Education, Diocese of Parramatta. That'll be chaired by Andy, and you'll have a chance to put your questions up. Remind you, please use the chat function on the screen. We've had some questions come to us in advance, so please take advantage of that. It's an interactive session that Adam will run then. We'll then 5 minutes to spend a couple of awards and scholarships we're announcing today, and then I'll be talking to Jared Neesham, he's not bad for a sand groper, remarkable West Australian who now understands the power of rugby league in changing attitudes towards school of young Indigenous men in Western Sydney particularly, and we'll hear about that program and digital equity and a range of issues with Jared. Then there's Adam will chair a session with Renee Thompson, Aboriginal Affairs, Helen Hamilton-James, the Managing Partner of Deloitte Western Sydney, Scott Langford from St George Community Housing, SGCH, and Ramin Malik, young engineering student from Bankston Poetry Slam and a member of Generation West, about how Western Sydney is positioned to respond to emerging industry. And then more Q&A, and I'll wrap it up with an interview with Mark Scott, the very well-credentialed, highly respected head of Education New South Wales. So it's a pretty impressive program, everybody. Just before I go to Professor Shergold, can I, again, thanks School of Infrastructure New South Wales. As you'll see on screen, some of our other partners there, Kimberwali, Catholic Education, Parramatta, the NUW Alliance in charge of the multiversity out at the Aerotropolis, TAFE New South Wales, and the wonderful universities of Sydney and Western Sydney, all part of it. Just remind you, you can, as I'm told, the young people in my office tell me, you can engage via social media, or as they call it, media, by using the at WSL Dialogue and using the hashtag out there 2020. They're both on screen in case I butchered the description of them. And again, put your questions in through the chat function. In introducing Peter, I think it's worth pointing out why we're doing this session and why education is that important to us. When you're representing a region like Western Sydney that isn't the Western Sydney I grew up in Parramatta, it's a much more evolved species now. But one thing that hasn't changed is the core requirement of education, skills and training. If we are going to take 2.5 million people now or 4 million people in 20 years' time into the type of lifestyle, the type of jobs, the type of life they would like, then education, skills and training remain the key. Even more acute during a COVID pandemic recovery. It's almost like when I left school in 1983, the job prospects of school leavers now have suddenly taken a distinct turn for the worse. And for regions that used to soak up a lot of that young workers on factory lines and production lines that now has to invent new jobs, the challenge for us is even greater. How we can make sure the great infrastructure and development agenda is met by skills to match, and how we can make sure that our universities and our TAFEs and our high schools are working so closely together. It is therefore a perfect opportunity and segue to go to Peter Shergold. Most of you know him as the Chancellor of Western Sydney University. So I first met Peter when he was the boss of ATSIC, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, many years ago. And along the way, he took a small role as the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. But more recently, he's also been chairing the TAFE review along with David Gonski. If anything screams integration, it's two university chancellors doing a review of TAFE at the moment. And also he's the chair of NESA in New South Wales and has just finished chairing the Education Review Panel for COAG about pathways and others. So, Peter, welcome, sir. Thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, we have to unmute you. I'm sorry, Peter. We've had our first. There we go.
Am I unmuted
now? We got that out of the way early, our first technical.
Okay. So, well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Renee for that really thoughtful introduction to culture. You know, this is a pretty challenging out there summit, big issues to discuss at, frankly, a pretty scary time. And I do draw sustenance that about 200 metres from my shoulder is the Parramatta River. And we know that Aboriginal people lived there for at least 30,000 years. And I get some sustenance from that perspective. So it's great to join you today, Christopher.
Thanks, Peter. I completely agree. So you've just finished this pathways piece for COAG.
Yes, I'm doing advertising now, looking to the future.
Well, I'll stop you. If you haven't read the Telegraph this morning, there's a nice op-ed that gives it a rap as well from some bloke with an ugly photo. It's looking this pathways, this modern thinking of integrating high school TAFE universities. What did you learn from that particularly that's going to change the way we do things in the West?
Well, I've spent most of my life in tertiary education. So doing this review and talking to a large number of workshops of young people, senior secondary students, it got me to think about the purpose of education again. And I realised that what young people need as they come into adulthood in this very uncertain world with very uncertain future of work is the assurance that they can keep on learning throughout their life. If they haven't learned to learn, then we have a problem. So that was the first thing that came to me. And then I thought, well, why are we doing it? Now, we all know we learn because it makes our lives more meaningful. But I am happy to say there is, a utilitarian purpose to education. It's just, I think, my perspective is a bit wider than sometimes the government puts forward. So, yes, I do think we need to prepare people for the workforce of the future. But I also think in this time when liberal democracies are under real challenge, we also need to prepare people to become active citizens. So that's what I was thinking about as I talked to young people on senior secondary pathways. And it became obvious to me that, unfortunately, ATAR, in my view, in the panel's view, was distorting secondary education. We didn't call for the abolition of ATAR. We think it can play a moderately useful role for universities as a ranking tool for people who are going to universities. But frankly, more and more universities don't use it exclusively in that way. And my key message is, well, let's think about the 75% of students in senior secondary school who are not going to go to university on the basis of their ATAR. Let's think about their education. Because the trouble is students and their mums and dads get ATAR and the HSC completely mixed up. And that then distorts what happens in senior secondary education. And at the most profound level, gives a privilege to, if you like, academic subjects over vocational education and training.
Peter, before you were the Secretary of PM&C, others before you, back in the Hawke era, I remember cheering it on when the then Prime Minister Hawke announced children which should stay on. We had very low retention rates. When I finished high school at Cumberland High in North Parramatta of Carlingford in 1983, I can tell you on a handful of my kids who went to university in my class. It just didn't happen, particularly in Western Sydney. That had a distinct change in government policy to encourage students to stay right through, and we'd all hail that as a very sensible policy. Up to the point now, though, where it also, in some ways, took away from TAFE. It provided the glamour to only university education, and it's in some ways affected those pathways and our skill set as a nation. Looking back, was it the right policy, or did it just need more tweaking? Do we go too far? How do we recalibrate that now so that TAFE isn't seen as a second-class education that had been for too many years, and that students in high school who are forced to stay, who don't want to go on, don't distract those who do want to achieve higher academic achievement?
Well, look, I think the fact that far more students now go to the end of year 12 is a very significant advantage. That has been a big step forward. And I would say there's another thing that I've seen that has significantly improved, and that is the level of pastoral care which schools now provide. So those are great positives. But my problem here is that in getting more students to stay to the end of year 12 and having them want to stay to the end of year 12, I think we've got to do a much better job of pointing people to a tertiary education in which there are lots of pathways we know people take between universities and TAFE, higher and tertiary education and so on. Now, what's happening, unfortunately, at schools too often is people at 15 or 16 are almost being asked to make a choice between higher education, therefore you're going to go into these, if you like, the ATAR academic streams, or the others that are vocational education. Now, whether we mean it or not, the others too often think that they're somehow second class. And I have to say that overall, there are exceptions, but overall, the accessibility and the quality of the vocational education that we provide at schools is second rate compared with what we do academically. I think there is a problem in New South Wales. I think there's a problem with Western Sydney in that those who are studying vocational subjects, the great majority don't even end up with a certificate. They don't end up with a Cert 2 or Cert 3. They end up with something called a statement of attainment. And I've had students tell me, actually, we see that as a statement of failure. Now, that's the challenge we have to address.
At a university level, though, we're also interested in the type of courses that are there to prepare our students for the future. I know, for example, a large part of the worker base of Western Sydney, in these days highly skilled, highly remunerated in many cases, in areas such as the sales industry. You know, it's the last great place for those without a uni degree to make a fortune. Why is there no university program to teach you how to sell? Why is there no university program that teaches you community critical engagement and great thinking? Do we need, in a way, the 3 R's equivalent? Is there a need for an integrated education, a review of the type of programs that really would reflect the skill set our economy and society needs?
So that's an interesting way to put it, Christopher, because in a way, that is part of the challenge. And one of the difficult things if you're in vocational education or you're running New South Wales TAFE is that increasingly more and more of the subjects that used to be seen as vocational are now being swept in to universities. And of course, I do that at Western Sydney University. I think we have to stop and think, hang on a moment, this demarcation we are drawing between higher education on the one hand and vocational education on the other makes less and less sense. There is a tertiary sector. And young people, frankly, and this is a great thing, are voting with their feet. They'll do some higher education, some vocational education. Increasingly, they will do micro-credentialing. That isn't in the Australian Qualities Framework at all. That is a great thing. That's what we should be encouraging. We should be encouraging universities and TAFEs to become, closer together. What we've got to do at school is to get to people that there are all these pathways when you leave school. And what we've got to say to people is, what are you learning at school? Yes, it's very good that in history, if you learn why Australian Federation came about, or you learn calculus in maths. But what are you really learning from that? You're learning a series of attributes, and you can learn those in different ways. You can learn those from doing vocational education. So what do we know we need for the future? We need people who are able to solve complex problems. You can learn that in history. You can learn that in plumbing. We need people who can communicate effectively, who can collaborate, who can be creative. So what I'm really saying in my report is, let's make those attributes explicit and let's capture them in a learning profile. And so you can learn those through the academic subjects. You can learn them from vocational education. And I suppose this is where the report gets really bold. It says, with teachers' help, young people can recognise how they're learning them in all sorts of different ways outside the classroom. And I don't just mean, Duke of Edinburgh awards. I'm really thinking of Western Sydney here and, lower social class. If you are at home with migrant parents acting as their interpreter, what amazing learning that is. If you are looking after your mum with a disability while you're doing school, how amazing is that as learning? If you're doing Saturday night shifts at McDonald's or working for the Red Cross, what amazing learning opportunities that is. If you are in, a remote area of Australia and you've got young men leaving school for quite long times to go and do a secret ceremony. Now, some of that is secret, some of it is not. And what is not is an amazing learning opportunity. So what I would love at school is to capture these learning attributes, what you've got from school, as well as what you've developed outside school.
I'm in the middle of a 3-week stretch as a single parent to a 4-year-old. I'm learning plenty, trust me. I haven't learned how to plait my hair properly yet, I'm told, or to brush it without crying, but I'm learning along the way. Last question for you, Peter. You're also chairing the TAFE review, and Stefan Forby will be joining us in the next session from TAFE as well. You and David Gonski, we talk about, and as a few questions came in, how do we make TAFE effectively saying as sexy as universities have been, and I'd say put sexy chancellors in to some extent, celebrity chancellors like yours. But without being glib about that, is that part of the issue for TAFE? Do we need to, not only the curriculum and the substance of TAFE and vocational education, do we actually need to invest in its marketing? Do we need to have successful TAFE people talk about it's cool to be at TAFE? You don't have to be at university to be considered the cool kid in the playground.
Yes, I think it is possible to do that. What I discovered at the moment, and we had some behavioural psychologists work with us, is university now tends to be the default option in many schools. And we have to make vocational education sexy. It is sexy, if we can get past COVID-19, to be able to, you can run your own business in your 20s. That's pretty sexy. You know, we've got to get the attributes and what vocational education can offer. I think you're right. One of the things that David and I, working with Stefan, working with Mark, are thinking about is how can we have, if you like, some, exemplar parts of TAFE, which are, beacons of the future, which can actually make, if you want, vocational education sexy. And I think one of the ways to make it sexy is to have institutions which can bring together vocational and higher education much more than they are at the moment. Forget just co-location, forget universities saying to TAFE, well, we will recognise those TAFE courses for entry to university. No, let's try and think of a way we can integrate tertiary education for young people.
What can I say? I first joined the WSU board 8-9 years ago, in my 8-year period. The relationship with TAFE was not a healthy one, even in Western Sydney. To see that turnaround in that period is quite remarkable. So I know you're living it as well as talking about it. You're walking the walk as well as talking the walk, Peter. So thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for just simply your capacity in the career to make education itself sexy again in the West. And the 45,000 students, particularly the Academy. I'm, as you know, the hugest fan in the world of the Academy in Western Sydney and the Citizen Scholar program, and half of them are keep tweeting on the side of our chat page. One person said Peter Shergold for PM. He used to serve PMs, advised that he should be it. And someone else said more Scotty Cam ads to make TAFE sexy. But either way, we look forward to, again, can we show your report one more time, where they can find the...
So please do. And there is a short version. It's called Looking to the Future. We will link it to everybody after the session. Up on our website, we'll link it to everybody. Peter, thank you very much for your time, sir. Thank you.
I'm hoping I'll have a seamless handover to your Vice Chancellor of all things external, Andy Marks. I'm just waiting for his very attractive face to appear on my screen, who's going to lead us through the next session, the panel session. Where is he? The sex symbol of the Blue Mountains. In fact, he's never looked so good. Now, no, unfortunately, you've just gone and destroyed everything I said about you by appearing on camera.
All this talk of sex symbols, I've dialed into the wrong conference.
Yeah, this is not the dark web you normally are, sir. This is professional education online here. So I'll get out of your hair, mate, and let you run through the next session.
Terrific. Thanks, Christopher. And always fantastic to hear from the Chancellor, Professor Shergold. That report will actually literally be transformative. So thank you. As usual, my honoured colleague Christopher's run a little bit over time, so we're going to have a very compressed session, and we'll be out of your hair by about 10:20 for a bit of Q&A where you all get to chime in and have your say. These people need no introductions. It's Amy Brown from Premier and Cabinet, Stephen Forby from TAFE, Stephen Garden from Uni of Sydney, Anthony Manning from Schools Infrastructure, and Greg Whitby, of course, from Catholic Education. Come on down, everybody, as they used to say in Queensland. The topic we're looking at today is about creating smart cities of the West. I actually think, here we go, we have movement at the station. Hello, Stephen. Great. G'day, everybody. All right, so we're going to kick off with a couple of questions for the panel, and I'm going to turn to Amy first. And I want to get to as many of you multiple times as possible, so I'll ask that you try and keep your answers concise. Amy, I don't think anybody in the room would criticise the public health response of the state government. It's still an ongoing thing, and of course it's a very fraught time at the moment given what our colleagues in Melbourne are going through in Victoria. But I think the public health response has been exemplary, and I'd like to think that that's the result of good planning and a lot of people working together. I'm sure it is. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the economic response and how it relates to Western Sydney, and get your thoughts, if I can, on how you see things unfolding on the economic front and on the employment front for Western Sydney in the period ahead.
Thanks, Andy. So as you say, New South Wales as it currently stands is doing okay, and that's actually not a fluke. It is due to that very strong public health response in this state, capability at the centre, capability in local health districts, ability to wrap around the communities, track and trace and get on top of community transmissions quickly, strict with our borders, quarantining, a huge joint effort between, New South Wales Police and Service New South Wales and central agencies through what's called the State Emergency Operations Centre. But as you've foreshadowed, it was not only when we were kind of in early stages of the COVID response, we were very clear that we did not only want kind of epidemiology data, we also wanted to know the economic data and the well-being data as people's lives were impacted. And so what then enabled us to do was make some really smart decisions. So for example, continuing with key sectors such as construction and mining, which represent almost 15% of GVA, that the continued operation of that did manage to kind of help us from an economic health perspective. Also, what my team were in charge of was a lot of the well-being stuff. And we found out through, customer surveys that not being able to see family and friends was having a very big toll on people's mental health. So we were able to adjust our restrictions accordingly, which was kind of a really good way to go. We've also done some kind of forecasting as to what the likely COVID-related recession is going to do to people's mental health. And it is actually very troubling. So, for example, for every 1% increase in unemployment, there's a 4% increase predicted for suicide. So what are we as government doing for a kind of strong response there? The other thing I just wanted to call out was the impact on young people. So a lot of the sectors that were impacted the most and will continue to be impacted, things like arts and recreation, retail, accommodation and food services, hospitality, these employ a lot of young people. And as it currently stands, the unemployment rate for young people is 16.1%, with 45% of job losses being for those under 25. Very relevant to this discussion. Just so you know the impacts of that, it's been shown through research, early displacement from the labour force has the potential to have cumulative lifetime earning losses of up to 20%, and graduating into a recession can lead to reduced earnings for a decade of around 9%. So this panel, I would love to hear, what are we doing for reskilling and particularly for our young people? What are the opportunities for that, and how can we kind of work together to solve this?
Look, I think that's fantastic, and it's a brilliant segue into Stefan, and I'll get to you in a moment, Stefan, on how we address that cumulative impact. But I think actually the fact that there's such a big focus on well-being is quite heartening, and the fact that you're using evidence to build that response is also very encouraging. I know those youth unemployment figures you mentioned as well, as we've discussed in the past, Amy, they're worse in some parts of Western Sydney where it's upwards of 25%. So we just really need to have that urgency, and it's great to see it coming from the top of government. Stefan, if this displacement from the labour market is such and obviously a cataclysmic occurrence across Western Sydney and New South Wales more broadly, how do we get in there quickly, and how do we stop things destabilising to the extent that we can't recover? I know TAFE's been incredibly busy in the last few months. Do you want to tell us a bit about that with the Western Sydney Edge?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I mean, There's a lot of ways we can do that, and there's a lot of ways we do that. I think we heard Professor Shergold talk about making TAFE sexy, and behind that sits some really significant effort and focus we have on making sure we are a very, very integral, close part of the whole educational ecosystem. And the way to do this is through partnerships and reaching out and be an absolute, sincere and genuine partner with universities, with industry, with schools, to make sure we have that very, very close involvement in that. Secondly, I'd say around investing in our sector, investing in the future, both through the facilities that we operate. I mean, in Western Sydney alone, we operate 22 different educational and training facilities. We run skills points headquarters, we run skills exchanges. And we have a pretty significant commitment by government to continue to invest in this. Just last year, we invested 22 million in facilities in Western Sydney. The big, most recent announcement around Kingswood is to make Kingswood the Western Sydney construction hub and elevate the level and the standards of what we do to what Peter Shergold talks about as the exemplar parts. We call them flagship institutions, the ones that are that attract the attention and the excitement of students, so that they realise that there is actually a real reason to consider TAFE and vocational training to be sexy. At the end of all this, there's jobs. There's jobs for those who choose to stay in the vocational sector, but there's also jobs for those who choose to take opportunity of what the future brings in terms of transcending between vocational pathways and into the university, the more academic pathway, and back again, so that we make it a two-way street. So there's lots of things that happen in that space, and I cannot express strongly enough how much I welcome that whole collaboration and partnership opportunity.
Absolutely. I will stress as well that the intense activity behind the scenes, certainly between TAFE and universities, is one of very heightened collaboration. And I think, Stefan, you'd agree with me that the dialogue's been very thick and very deep on that front. And certainly the Construction Hub and other initiatives will feature universities heavily working alongside TAFE. Which leads me on to Stephen at USyd. And Stephen, so much is said about the role of education in recovery, but I'm not quite sure that we understand completely just how extensive that is and what depth universities play in economic recovery, particularly in a place like Western Sydney, where USyd has a very strong history at Westmead and at Camden. Do you want to talk us through that role, the role unis play?
So thanks, Andy. So as people will know, I'm probably speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people. So I want to acknowledge that fact. But the campuses of the University of Sydney actually sit on the lands of 12 or 13 First Nations people. So all of that indicates that we're all over the place in terms of New South Wales, but we have a very substantial footprint in Western Sydney. We've got about 1,600 staff in those areas of Camden, Nepean, Westmead. We've got 20% of our research outputs comes from that area, a lot of it in collaboration with other academics at WSU and other areas. And actually a third of our undergraduate student population comes from Western Sydney already. So we see huge opportunities for investment in that area, because there are potential collaborations with TAFE, with WSU, with lots of other universities, because universities are an economic powerhouse. We invest in the local economy, in the local education infrastructure. Sydney spent about 100 million in the last 5 years in the Westmead campus, creating a range of new programs on offer. And of course, as you know, we're in active negotiation with the New South Wales government to try and get another campus in the Parramatta Westmead area. And that will be a huge opportunity, huge economic driver. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. We know that Western Sydney is going to be the demographic powerhouse for the state, and it's certainly for the city over the next 20 or 30 years. Interestingly, Parramatta has more people with a postgraduate qualification than any other suburb in Sydney. So it is all...
That's because of Western Sydney University, Stephen, of course, right?
Absolutely.
Joint effort.
A lot of reasons why we we would want to be in there. But I think people underestimate what an economic powerhouse all universities are. We've done just a little bit of analysis, and basically the economic impact of Sydney University alone to the New South Wales economy is $2.6 billion a year. Western Sydney would be getting up there. All of the universities are an amazing part of what this New South Wales economy is. We know education's the second biggest export industry in the state, and so on and so forth. But I think the challenge that a number of the other speakers have talked about, and Professor Shergold has talked about, is how do we prepare young people for the future? And I do think there are issues about pathways, about greater collaboration between universities, between TAFE and universities, and thinking through what the educational offer of universities has been. Jennifer Westacott of the Business Council of Australia quoted something about 6 months ago in a talk she gave at the university. About 25% of the jobs that kids in years 10 and 11 now will come to after they finish school have not been invented yet. So that creates that huge challenge about how are we preparing our students. And I think all of the universities are thinking through these issues. And when we talk to employers, it's about soft skills, communications, collaboration, teamwork, as well as technical skills. So I think thinking through micro-credentialing, the 60-year curriculum, people coming back and forth between TAFE and universities, as Professor Shergold said, much more collaboration across the whole tertiary sector, and thinking about the skills that we give to students.
I want to pick up on that point, Stephen. It actually leads very well into what I know Greg will be itching to talk about, which is around the need to do things differently, and perhaps how the most recent period has accelerated a lot of the stuff that Greg was already on. Greg, do you want to talk us through that, about how we can just use this period for the most benefit? You're on mute, mate.
How's that, better? This is not a COVID thing. This has been coming, as Peter Shergold's pointed out. I mean, everything he said sums up the way it needs to go. I'm really worried about the whole pathways issue. It's not pathways. We need a whole new model. I mean, there's no better example of the stupidity of the thinking, the fact that we've had a review of the New South Wales curriculum extrinsic from the HSC and has ignored all of the embedded issues in there. Quite clearly, we need a structure that moves away from a Commonwealth and a state approach to education to a commitment to lifelong learning, to a learning continuum. And that means we've got to stop talking about the curriculum, the credentials, etc. We need to have new ways of doing things. How we're approaching it here is through a range of partnerships. That's leading us into the future in new ways of doing things. So there's no one size fits anymore. No fits all anymore. The future is going to belong to the diversity and those that will determine their learning journey. All that Professor Shergold said is true, and there's one extra. Ask the learners, ask the teachers in our schools, ask the students in our schools. They're all learners. They're deeply frustrated. It's being played out in a whole range of different ways in increased costs and well-being and those sorts of things. But COVID showed us that you can do this thing and be major disruptor, and we've had outstanding examples across government, non-government sectors, how they've just changed the whole framework about how they've gone about the business. This issue of asking the students and providing multi-opportunities, and the whole issue of micro-credentialing, the default position into the future is going to be to the quality end of the market. And we're having ourselves on if we think we can maintain that just because we have a status in the path. There'll be new and different ways of people connecting. My worry is that if the education sector collectively doesn't get their mind around it, the Amazons of the world will take it over. And the issues that we talk about of what we need to take us forward, and Professor Shergold mentioned, those values. And the final point I want to make, Andy, just at this stage, is that this skills business. When I talk to industry, and we're in discussion with them a range of different things we're doing, leave the skills of this workplace to us, because we're actually facing, we don't know them as the technical skills. Give us young people who are curious, collaborative, can talk to each other, can take responsibility for their own learning, and we will add the value in. But if you give them to us, and we're going to have to do that by a multiple approach and forget this divide between academic and vocational. It doesn't exist anymore.
No, that's right.
I know I said it's the final thing, but the government's decision around, the federal government's proposition around charging double for humanities degrees says it all about the problem we have embedded in education policy. And it's played out right down the food chain, if you like, from the universities down, and you give that priority of order. And if we just do more of the same, we just be harder, we just make these decisions, we're going to go forward. Forget it. Don't drink that Kool-Aid.
Well, to quote business again, Greg, I mean, you mentioned Jennifer Westacott earlier. I know that she's said that what business are crying out for are critical skills, which come through the humanities. I would say that, though, being a political scientist. Thanks, Greg. Anthony, and I don't know about Amazon, but I certainly know Zoom's doing all right at the moment. So good luck to them. Anthony, if things are so radically changed, as all of our panellists have indicated, and particularly Greg, in the curriculum space, in the way we approach education, do we need radical change in the infrastructure area as well for education? And I know you were pushing the envelope before COVID, but do you need to rethink things again now that we're in this current situation?
Yeah, good morning. I think there is a fair amount of rethinking that needs to be done. I think the one thing we can take out of our experience with COVID so far is the strong link between the operation of schools and productivity and the stress on families. And I think one of the things that's been at risk in a lot of ways is really that engagement between communities, parents and schools. We can't afford for kids to miss large chunks of their education. We've got to find a way to deliver the education in a flexible way. And maybe that does mean we rethink the idea of how schools are positioned, where they're located, the relationship that communities have to them, and the way that a parent might do. You go out of your way to drop your kid at a school before you head to work. I wonder whether we need to think about how we bring some of these things together and make education and learning happen in a more flexible space. That means we can respond to these things. We've seen an amazing response in terms of the number of kids that were being taught from home, and the support that the system gave them was really quite phenomenal. But we saw the stress in the parents, and you see it playing out down in Victoria now as they go back to learning from home. So I think there are some clear linkages we can begin to look at in terms of where we might choose to locate schools, how we might share space, how we might join those links in. Because I think the key really is to keep that engagement at school level and make sure that we don't have kids missing huge chunks of their schooling, because it'll have massive ramifications further down. And we need to make that easy. We need to make that easy and sensible, and we need to continue to do it in a safe way. And we've put a lot of time and energy into that as it stands at the moment. But we've absolutely proved that parents, particularly working parents, want kids to go to school, and the system and the state needs them to be able to go to school. So we've got that productivity across the state. Yeah, agree. And I think that one of the real lessons that we've all learned from kids is resilience. I think they've shown us how to do it in spades. And we learned that from kids at the school level. So, and you've been a critical part of that, Anthony and Greg. Amy, I'm conscious we're in the home stretch, and we've only got probably enough space for you each to give me a minute or so to wrap up. And I did plan to ask you about what you might see as smart initiatives already in Western Sydney. So squeeze those in if you've got them. But Amy, I can't let you go without talking about your role in bringing Atlassian and Tech Central to life. How do we get that kind of knowledge job venture in Western Sydney? We'd love that out here. And why didn't you send them to Westmead?
I'm on my way.
Great job, by the way.
Yeah. In fact, just a funny aside, but someone put in the comments box just then, does Amy Brown ever take a breath? I've actually missed my calling as a rapper. Like, I could go on Australia's Got Talent, I think. But yes, Atlassian, now I don't need to kind of explain to you the benefits of precincts. The Premier has talked about a precinct-led recovery, economic recovery. Yep. Precincts are more than they're the whole that's bigger than the sum of their parts. It's where, global talent locates. It's where, we have knowledge and innovation and places where people want to live and work, and public space and amenity. So yes, I think what happens is government needs to think around what its strategy wants to be for a particular place. They need to be deliberate. Precincts are deliberate. They don't just kind of spring up and we're all, happily surprised. And so once government kind of works out what the focus of a precinct is going to be, often based on what I'd call natural endowments. So, for example, the location of a flagship hospital or the location of an airport, I think what it then needs to do is just start. Just start engaging with industry to work out who those anchor tenants are going to be, and just kind of get going on what can be the magnet effect, I suppose, of starting the kind of commercial arrangements to get it going. We can't do it alone. We need to partner with industry to seize those opportunities. It's a kind of symbiotic relationship. But one thing I just wanted to call out, and I know you're referring to the Atlassian deal in particular down at, Tech Central, is that we have gotten a lot more sophisticated in the way that we deal with industry to get these things going, right? So we are much better now at quantifying the economic benefit that justifies the deal, so that the private sector, these commercial entities, can make a return on their investment that is appropriate and justifiable. And often where there's a justification for doing so, we can do it as a direct deal, we can do a rapid market process, and we can also, where necessary, show that the state can co-contribute by way of funding or land or a concession, because it's a value for money proposition for the state, where we're actually kind of growing the economic benefit of a particular precinct and region, and therefore city and state. So just to call out that, we're getting more sophisticated, and we are looking forward to Westmead and also the Aerotropolis and replicating our engagement with industry there as well.
You stole my thunder. The Aerotropolis, I think that can be the next Tech Central and be bigger and badder even than that. So well said, Amy. Precincts-led recovery. Stefan, what do you think about that, precinct-led recovery? So we can have a situation where educational providers cluster alongside industry at concentrations of activity across Western Sydney. Can it work?
I love that idea. In fact, the other thing I can't help saying this, that it's actually something that TAFE were early adopters of. You can go 20 years back and look at, this is how long we've done precincts. In Coffs Harbour, for instance, as an example, we've got the Coffs Harbour Education Campus where we partner with the Southern Cross University around areas up there that are particularly relevant for that region. So the precinct model is not new. We've already proven that it works. Western Sydney, it will absolutely be the place to see this. I talked a little bit about the Kingswood facility, which is the Western Sydney construction hub. That'll become what we call a centre of excellence. And a centre of excellence for us is where we go in and basically disrupt ourselves. And we do this in the way we provide learning and teaching. We do it in the way we engage with industry. And we do it in such a way that the standards that we set for ourselves will attract not just industry, but certainly also students. But the third thing it'll do is it'll inspire the rest of us at TAFE, and we have 136 facilities running at the moment, to lift our game and lift ourselves out of the normal way or the classic way of thinking, so that we get into some of the things that we've talked about. We've heard Greg Whitby and others talk about how important it is that we really, really put some of these curriculum things to one side and talk about what it really looks like when we do things differently. So the Western Sydney Construction Hub will be ready with that in 2023. We'll have 700 students a year coming out with qualifications, construction qualifications, from plumbing to electrical to carpentry. They're discipline focused, and we won't just do that in construction. We'll do it in areas such as advanced manufacturing, hospitality, healthcare, and primary industries elsewhere in the state of New South Wales. And I think the key to all this is this the partnership, the approach where we coexist, not just for creation, but actually for delivery of training, where we have industry, universities, TAFE, and schools coexisting and co-delivering around these things, so that those pathways become more than pathways. They become the way we work going forward. It is less forced upon us. It's less created through sort of structures and framework. It's just the way to do it because it's the right way to do it. Andy, you're on mute.
Oh, back again. Amy, I think Stefan's just come up with a new slogan for TAFE, which is "We disrupt ourselves." If you could just let the boss know. I like that one. Stephen, conscious we're in the home stretch, got very little time, but the precinct model is the one that we have, and it's the one that's going to give us the most leverage. Can we accelerate things? But you said at Westmead, and Amy, I know you can probably agitate in that regard, but believe it or not, your peer universities want you to upscale at Westmead like you wouldn't believe. So any help we could get on that front would be great. Stephen, do you want to talk us through exactly where that's at?
So obviously we're talking to the government about this and in active conversation. We're slightly compromised by COVID budget cuts, and the government's obviously compromised by COVID financial challenges, but the Vice-Chancellor met with Stuart Ayres the other day to keep the conversation going. So we're certainly looking at it, and we're certainly expanding what we're doing in the Westmead Hospital precinct even before that conversation. But we really think doing it differently, doing it in collaboration and partnering with industry, as some of the other speakers have said, is really the way forward. And that's really our vision for the Western Sydney Parramatta campus, is to really partner with industry and get our students solving community organisation problems, industry problems. That is a fantastic educational offer and opportunity that we're all exploring.
I think if we can get the two tides of the Erythropolis and Westmead to rise together and have that interconnection between those two outer cities, that would be extraordinary. I mean, the cross-pollination you could have there, Stephen, would be amazing. You've got 5 universities in the mix, essentially.
Yeah.
Great. Greg, you've got probably just about 30 seconds.
Right,
What's next?
30
What's
seconds.
next for us?
I just want to make this one. It's not the what anymore. We've spent so much time on the what. All that horse is bolted. We've had reviews. The issue is how. And there are multiple hows now. That's what we've got to wrap our minds around. Nobody has ownership of this. It's the democratisation of learning, including the learners into that. And that will design the future. I have no better crystal ball than anyone else, but I'm going to stop talking about the what. That'll just wither and die. The how is how we're going to do it, and we're building it through diverse, connected learning communities in partnership with each other.
Okay, this is good. This is the next slogan. It's not the what, it's the how. We disrupt ourselves. Pressure's on, Anthony. What have you got? What do we need to do urgently in the next 6 months in your space?
So I think we're already well on the way. We're actively talking in a number of locations around the precinct concept. I think the idea of looking at locations of high schools and how they fit with TAFE and unis and how they fit alongside industry. We've been working on the Liverpool concept for a while now, which is exactly that. So I think all those things are there for us to do. There's just a sense of urgency now to get them over the line and make them happen, bring the parties together. But the atmosphere is right. The urgency, I think, is there, and the interest is there to do those things. It makes absolute sense to begin to join those dots. And I think we're well on our way in a series of locations to be able to do that, from sort of Meadowbank and all those other ideas that we're working our way through. That's beginning to happen.
Yeah, I think it is, without a doubt. To that person who put up a comment about neoliberal education and philosophical backdrops, I'll get to that point. And thank goodness you've got a humanities education person on the panel who can actually do that and is not in horrible debt. Thank you so much, everybody. Amy, next time we're going to make time for you to wrap, because now we know that's a hidden talent. Stefan, you have a career in marketing. I've got no doubt if things take a dive for TAFE, they won't. Of course, it's going great. Stephen, solidarity to you from another university person. It's a tough time, but we'll get through it. Greg, always entertaining and always highly original and challenging. And Anthony, you're the busiest bloke in education at the moment, I think, mate. So thank you, all of you, for being such great panellists. I'm going to hand you over to the wonderful Adam Lato to take you through the Q&A section.
Yeah, there was a natural segue there when you start talking about disruption to introduce me there, Andy, because I'm here to disrupt this session a little bit. I've been lurking in the chat room the past 25 minutes. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly around online learning. So I might start with that one and throw to Anthony in the first instance, talking about the recent enforced experience of virtual education. How has that changed infrastructure's conception of what a future school might look like, could look like, should look like? And I'm sure Greg might have a view on this one as well.
So I think, online learning is something that's now with us and will continue to grow. I think the tweaks to infrastructure, to some extent, aren't hugely dynamic. We're still going to need the classroom structures. We're working through flexible classroom structures that allow different sort of pedagogies to run through them. I think what we might need to do is begin to look at some of the hours of operation of schools and some of the access to IT systems, recognising that there are still a lot of kids that don't have access to the internet at home. And so it's great that we can provide it in schools, but once they leave, they don't have access to it. So I think we need to think about how we provide that access out of hours, whether that means schools stay open for longer, or whether we actually work with councils and libraries and begin to work out how those things. But I think we will need to accommodate more and more. The schools we've got are pretty well supported from an IT perspective within them. It's really how we shape the spaces that allow the kids to do what they need to do to deliver their learning as part of that process. And to some extent, we also may need to think about how we might go about broadcasting some of that from various schools. So actually giving teachers the ability to run kind of online courses and lessons from within the school itself. So I think there are some changes that work their way through that. I don't think they're massive, and I think the new spaces that we're building are pretty flexible and will give us the room to play with those. But it's probably that, how do we make sure those kids that don't have Wi-Fi access at home are still able to continue their learning is probably the biggest challenge. And we probably need to work through with one of the bigger providers how we actually manage that.
Equity and access have been probably those two issues that you refer to that have gotten a lot of attention, particularly in Western Sydney, which probably has a lower than average internet usage rate. Greg, you've been quite vocal on this issue. What are your views?
The issue for me is getting clear what the discussion is. So we talk about online learning and learning remotely and all blended learning and all those sorts of things. That's been going on for 2 decades now. And the issue is not the technology per se, it's just an enabler. That's all it is. 5G and beyond, when we're getting those sorts of technologies that are coming, they're real, they're not bleeding edge. Those sorts of issues will help us do something very fundamental. What we're finding is designing a system around how you bond and strengthen the learning community. This is a community issue first and foremost, because everything that we've said so far, it's about partnerships, collaboration, etc., and precincts. So you're talking about it's a community issue. So then the issue becomes for us around synchronous and asynchronous delivery. Our experience tells us from what happened it's happening through the COVID pandemic is that you can deliver into learning spaces and kids can access this, but what's missing is the teacher at the other end. How do you have the relationship so that the students receiving or participating in, but then needs to make sense of those sorts of things, which happens in a normal classroom. So we're looking at both asynchronous and synchronous that will help us work through those. We're finding that the more resource that the teacher source that you put in, I'm not necessarily talking about just a person, we put that teacher in to help moderate and to help curate the understanding, the more powerful is the learning. And obviously that can happen anywhere and any time. Now the issue around time is now negotiable, and we're finding that our peak periods of our usage of our networks are well outside the traditional 9 to 3. So that's telling us something about how people want to learn, where they want to learn. And it goes back to my comment in this, there are multiple hows in it, but it's how we actually see learning taking place. It's not, how we chunk the curriculum, how we do the time and all those sorts of things. But it says to us in our spaces, all our spaces, schools we're building, we're co-locating them in shopping centres and and in science and tech parks, and making them as flexible as possible so that they can be repurposed, that they're open and embedded in the community.
Yeah, I think your comment earlier about it, not trying to have a one-size-fits-all approach to learning and education is the best way to summarise all of that. Just conscious of time.
Robust background, like that. Yeah, that goes without saying, and that's where that's where government should be playing the policy. Forget the what. You leave the what to the experts. You look after, the infrastructure that we do need to deliver what you want.
Indeed. We've got a few minutes left, so I've got one good question here, which I'll throw to all of you to have a response to. You might have to get your crystal balls out to answer it, but when we look back at the 2020 cohort in our schools, what will future studies tell us about the positives and adverse impacts? Predictions from all of our panellists. What's the future going to tell us about 2020?
I wrote to all the Vice Chancellors and the ministers, federal and state ministers yesterday, and asked them to consider as a policy initiative providing free education, free university TAFE or whatever for this cohort, because they have gone through something that is so different. They have been fantastic about it, and it's a strategic investment in the future. It will help the universities out, help everybody out. And what it tells us about is they can do anything. That's what it tells us. But they just need that leg up.
Amy, what will future studies tell us about 2020?
I think there'll be many PhDs on 2020 for decades to come. Couple of things for me. Did we take the opportunities that 2020 gave us? So, for example, when we do talk about reskilling and retraining, particularly as people have been rendered unemployed, did we pivot them? I hate the word pivot. Did we direct them towards sectors where there's growing demand for jobs? So, for example, I would use the care workforce as an example. Aged care and disability was the fastest growing occupation until February 2020, before all of this even got really bad. So, how do we actually use that as an opportunity to get more people into the care workforce? I think it will also show us what we did around equity and equal access to opportunities, and it was the discussion around digital that made me think of that. How do we make sure that all kids in particular, not every kid has laptops and iPads falling from the sky. Anthony Manning has a great example where they put, on a particularly disadvantaged town, they put solar panels on the roof of the school, sold the energy back to the grid and paid for Wi-Fi in the town so that the kids could do their homework. That's what 2020, if we do that sort of thing well, that's what 2020 will say to me.
Thank you, Amy. Professor Stephen Garton.
So, Adam, I think if we look back on 2020 in a few years' time, I think we will say that the education sector, the schools, TAFE, and the universities have been remarkably agile in a very difficult context. But I think one of the things that will also be said is we're underinvesting in education more generally. And we have a kind of ethos in the Commonwealth Government that education is a cost, it's a budget impost, and we've got to keep controls on it, but actually education is an investment in our future, and we need to think about the investment strategies and see education as an investment question, not a cost question. And I think we, relative to other countries, particularly in our region but overseas, Australia's OECD average investment in education more generally is low. And I think the challenge will be making the investment higher and more meaningful and more strategic. That will be our challenge.
Good call. Stefan, it's been a big year for TAFE 2020. Some challenges along the way. What are your views?
I think that the learnings from this, as far as I'm concerned, is that hopefully this will be the moment, the watershed moment, where we will all jump out of this shadow where things were difficult and where these difficulties actually almost became self-fulfilling prophecies in terms of stalemate. I remember one of my colleagues, when I joined here 6 months ago, showed me 17 reviews into the vocational training sector that took place in the last 3 years. And when I asked him to tell me what it led to, he was really challenged, because that actually didn't lead to that much. I think the threat and the challenges that COVID brought about has really given us all a kick up the backside, and it has shown us that we can jump out of that shadow and we can actually move quickly. It might not be pretty, it works. We had, for instance, 8,000 teachers taught to go online, and I saw them that first day they were going online. There was a bit of nerves, particularly amongst those who used to train and teach through overhead projectors and those sorts of things. I think that my key message from all this is we can do a lot more than what we have allowed ourselves to think we could. We've focused on the limitations, and we've talked too much, discussed too much, but not acted enough. I think we'll learn from this exercise that, or this situation, that this is the time where we demonstrate there's no other way.
Thanks, Stefan. You've come up with some good slogans today too that Andy mentioned earlier, and there's a couple more in there that you've flagged. Final word, Anthony Manning, 2020.
I think a lot of it will be how we react to the disruption around being in facilities and then not being able to get access to those facilities. And I think the change will be where we see schooling taking place and how we enable that to occur. I think that's kind of one of the things that's going to come out of 2020. Do we really see schools as the sole place where people are learning? Can we deliver it from elsewhere if we have to? And how do we go about that? And that goes to some of the equity issues we've talked about. I think the other thing that'll come out of 2020 is that link between schooling and the ability for parents to access the workforce. And what might come out is a different relationship between school hours and work hours, and some flexibilities that run through that. So actually we make that easier. And some of that might be locational, some of that might be timing. I think there's a whole range of those things. But I think we've kind of reestablished a really hard link between access to school and then the productivity that flows from the fact that kids are in school, whether it's early childhood and all the way through. And I think we need to have a really strong focus on that, because you can see that a small disruption can have a much bigger disruption further down that chain. And I think over the years we've lost that linkage.
Thanks, Anthony. We're out of time. Thank you all for your time this morning. It's been great. A lot of interesting conversation. I think what I heard is, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, what sector you're working within, your views on the curriculum, infrastructure, disruption, there appears universal agreement that the jobs of tomorrow won't be coming unless we get the right building blocks in place. So a lot of confidence knowing that we've got people like you at the helm across the board, and I'm sure that there'll be further discussion throughout the rest of the year and ongoing. Christopher, I'll throw to you now. I know you've got some special acknowledgements, but once again, thank these guys for their time. It's been great.
First acknowledgement, put your arms together, as we say in office, for the panelists was fantastic. And just reflecting, by the way, before you all go, is that off screen, is that how far we've come. When I left school in 1983, there was no Western Sydney Uni. You can become a plumber or a chippy at TAFE, and that's it. And I had to hop on 2 buses, a train, and schlep to Redfern to get to uni for 1 year. That's all I lasted. The tyranny of distance was too great. That's my excuse. But how far we've come with vertical high schools, with the first 2 STEM schools in New South Wales, Greg's delivering one at the Science Park, WSU will do one up at Hawkesbury. Stephen Garton's hopefully going to get the great new campus at Westmead. And if we can stop planning, taking his lands up around Erytropolis, we'll get more, even north and south Bringelly. Stefan's leading a revolution in TAFE. It's changing, and we've got a rock star like Amy Brown who gets the fact that education is an economic pillar of Western Sydney, not only a social one. So we'll beat ourselves up a little bit. There's plenty more to do, but wow, how far we've come. And I can point out also, Greg Whippy's 200 years old this year, Catholic education. He doesn't look it, but it's 200 years since the Catholics started educating kids in Western Sydney. That's a lot of hands hit with rulers to stop people being left-handed, Greg. The devil's work, but remarkable. So I want to thank the panel completely, and to Andy and Adam, moderators extraordinaire. Thank you kindly, everybody. Now I can see another little name at the bottom, Danny Resick. I have the great pleasure of interviewing my friend Danny Resick for a couple of minutes. We'll get Danny. There he is. Oh, look at Deloitte branding. You'll love him. We might unmute you too, Danny. Danny was for many years until recently the managing partner of Deloitte Western Sydney, a former distinguished background in the automotive sector before he came into Deloitte. He's famous in our region for being the architect of shaping future cities, which I described as probably the best private sector contribution to public policy I've ever seen. They came up with the concept of 200,000 new smart jobs in Western Sydney before it became federal and state government mantra. They engaged everybody across, from students to ministers to even mugs like me, sitting on panels, becoming champions, and taking up the issue of how to train up Western Sydney. Danny, I know you've ascended into a newer role towards the back end of your Deloitte career, but you've now taken on education in Western Sydney as well as one of the issues you're facing. I just wanted on behalf, we normally do this in front of a big audience, Danny, but on behalf of my patrons, 5 wonderful people, to offer you this year a Patrons Prize for your contribution to corporate social responsibility and public policy. That program, your legacy of shaping future cities, now being adopted by Deloitte around the country and I think around the world, is an incredible model. And you must be very proud of how this sort of debates we're having, in some ways sparked by a group of well-meaning accountants down there in the beautiful Deloitte building in Parramatta, near Parramatta Station. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, that's a very generous introduction. And I guess the first thing I would say, it was a huge team effort. It was such a, I suppose when we started the whole process, I don't think we really understood what we'd actually started, to be frank. It started as an economic blueprint.
That's what your partners say about how much money you poured into the thing, I'm sure.
So the reality is, I think we are incredibly proud of what we helped bring about, and I think the collaboration and the cooperation and the collegiality of everyone across all those different sectors right across Western Sydney was what made it so powerful. Everyone wanted it to succeed, and I think that's what made me so proud, was the fact that everyone contributed so willingly, not only their time, their experience, their insights, and in many cases some of their data sets to help frame up the, I guess, not the issue but the opportunity. And that's the way we tackle it, was let's realise the opportunity that is Western Sydney, and let's not leave it to chance.
Well, that's what we call ourselves, the dialogue. For that reason, when it started debate, and it did a remarkable job. We're proud to be involved, myself and Adam from day dot, with you and Theo and your team and Helen now, and succeeding you, maintaining the momentum Deloitte in that process. It really was a remarkable achievement, and I say to all of our corporate partners, if you can have that level of engagement of the private sector looking at public policy, then we truly get the PPP in place. And there's not been enough of it, in my experience. There's a lot of work done by government in policy. There's not nearly enough done by the private sector in public policy, and I think that was the man bites dog moment that got government interested and rewarding it to want to flow through, and forms the bedrock now of the promise, your ambition to become a government promise of 200,000 jobs in the Western City alone. So maybe it's 400,000 if we throw the Central City in as well, double the number. But just wanted on behalf of the patrons, Danny, to thank you personally, the crusade you led, and to wish you the best as you continue now, particularly a focus on education in the West for Deloitte, which is even better. But mate, to thank you very much for the contribution you made and continue to make through this forum and in our region.
Great, thanks, Chris, and I look forward to continuing my involvement. Cheers.
Thank you, Danny. I also, while we're in the spirit of great acknowledgements, I wanted to announce this morning, on behalf of the dialogue, we set up a program of educational scholarships a couple of years ago. I've been using the modest fees that I received as the director of Western Sydney Uni to fund into a system of scholarships for young kids from the West. You'll see on screen there, Adam, with last year, some of last year's recipients. We partnered up with the Western Sydney, the Public Education Foundation to provide scholarships for talented young senior school high students in the West to help their pathway to TAFE or to university, further education. And it announced this year that we're extending that now further to students from these schools: Birrong Girls High School, Liverpool Girls High, Condell Park High School, Bankstown Senior College, Aids High School, Elizabeth MacArthur High School, two from Elizabeth MacArthur High School, and Westfield Sports High. Not because Adam went to Westfield Sports High and was one of the great undiscovered soccer players of the region, but it's it's wonderful on our behalf to be able to continue to provide that financial support through the Public Education Foundation. We'd encourage any of the corporates watching, if they want to get involved and join us. It's a great system. It takes all bureaucracy out of it. Your money goes straight to the student, and it's a wonderful, wonderful way to do that. I'm particularly pleased that we've got one for Aids High School because, as some of you know, it's my ambition in life is to ensure that in future we don't build a high school next to a primary school, next to a high security children's jail. Talk about a negative circle there, and one to the other. So it's delighted that the kids like Christian Bless out of Aids High are doing so well to come to our attention that we can support them. So that's a pleasure. Now, it is my also great pleasure to introduce Jared Neesham to you. Jared's the boss of the CLONTARF Foundation, there he is, about to pop up on screen. It exists to improve the education, discipline, life skills, self-esteem and employment prospects of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men by doing so, equipping them to be better contributors to society. It's fair to say Jared, who was an esteemed ex-AFL coach in the West, saw the power of footy in the West to help those kids come through. And in more recent years, that has also now been extended to the East Coast and to the states of Queensland and New South Wales, where the great code of rugby league is also used. We've been involved with CLONTARF for a little bit, and particularly helping out at Chifley College in recent times, where my entire team went and saw pre-COVID the remarkable young men. And as the father of the 25-year-old and a 20-year-old son, I've never met a group of young men as I did in that homeroom at Chifley College in Mount Druitt, where everything else is stacked against them. But to go in and meet a group of impressive, dynamic, confident, polite, talented young men who greeted us and then proceeded to kick our butts in table tennis over the next half an hour was a remarkable achievement. So, Jared, we might unmute you and I'll have a chat to you. Mate, you said came out of the school teacher and an AFL coach, and you saw the power of footy and other programs grown beyond that now. But you're many years into it, and having had a lot of time involved in Indigenous causes over my career, it seems to be the most successful program I've come across for engaging young men in this way.
Well, thanks for having me on Chris. It's a really exciting thing. I agree with everyone else who's been on the panel. Education is the most critical thing for our whole future as a country, and that means education for everybody. I had to get sacked as an AFL coach before I decided I wanted to go back to teaching. It wasn't sort of where my career path was going. But I talked with at-risk kids in and out of juvenile jails in my early years and other emotionally disturbed kids, and we didn't get any change when I was a young teacher. And what I found was doing what, in this case, the boys loved, what their existing passion was, they voluntarily changed their behaviour, which you witnessed at Chifley. I witnessed yesterday morning in Perth with a bunch of Year 7 Kalgoorlie boys who not be going near school, and here they were on a big trip down to Perth, 500 kilometres from Cal, and happy as a lark. So really we just put something in that makes them teachable. And I think the first aspect of the biggest influencer on education is attendance. Now, that should be a given, but it's not. And attendance is paramount, and then having the confidence to learn is the second most important thing. And we really just work on those two things, and then work in partnership with the teachers and the.
We should explain to the uninitiated. The concept is a homeroom within the CLONTARF room within a school. So you go in and partner with the school, many schools across the system, public and I think some private schools, where you go in and set up a distinct room that is a safe space, an engaging space. But the Aboriginal boys between classes, before school, after school, and then sporting and civics programs within.
Yeah, it's a intense full-time program put in a school. The men that are placed in there, Jeff Hardy or Ant Mitchell, whoever these great men are, develop a relationship with these boys, because that's what's really missing in their life. They're missing a relationship with a man, and we put these men permanently in their life. We've got about 460 men across 132 schools across Australia. and we stay there for a long time. And I mean, anywhere between 40 and 50 years is how long our program is going to be in the school system. Hopefully, it will never be used after that because it won't be needed. And part of that is obviously a common room, but all the stuff that we give these boys is pretty special. Camps, footy training, competitions, tournaments. But to access that, they have to behave and they have to come to school and go to class and try and establish some respect for teachers. One of the things that wasn't put on the plate today, which is probably reasonable, but of 67 countries that were tested in regards to behaviour in class, number one being the best behaved and 68 actually being the worst behaved, we were 63.
Wow.
And that in itself needs to be sorted. And, you know, having been a teacher, my two daughters are teachers, you know that it's the behaviour of the children in the class that really affects the ability for the teacher to get stuff across. And all this other stuff that we're talking about is critically important, but you also have to deal with this at the bottom. So we deal with that. We change their behaviour through these, you know, through the events, through the daily contact that you've seen, the training, the meeting people like yourself, having to engage with you socially, all that rich sort of wraparound stuff we do allows the teachers to be able to teach, and then we get the outcome that we want, which is great education for our Indigenous ATSI boys.
In a region like Western Sydney, home to the largest Indigenous population in Australia, and a lot of kids, particularly in some tough parts of town around Mount Druitt and other places in Blacktown, the program has special significance. And as I said, I was introduced by Gus Gould, the great, you know, rugby league icon of Western Sydney as well, who has got involved. My only complaint is, and I've raised it earlier, is that it's so successful with young Aboriginal boys. We need to try and work with education to find similar programs for young Indigenous girls. And it was raised with me at the Chifley College when I was there by one of the young Islander boys who I've been to, who asked what we were doing there. And I explained the CLONTARF involvement. He said, it's great. When can we have one? When can there be a Pacifica room? Are governments or other not-for-profits talking to you without stealing all your IP about how we can actually roll the success of CLONTARF out to broader gender and race-based programs?
Well, there are girls' programs, and they've started after us, and I suppose they've copied as much as they can off us, and we've given them as much as we can. So we're not interested in withholding any of our IP in that regards. We have stayed true to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island boys because they are the most at-risk group in Australia collectively. I mean, you go to our state here in West Australia, 80% of the juvenile jails Aboriginal. Queensland's the same, 100% of the territory.
Sad fact, but true.
So we have to stay as fine-tuned as we can. But having said that, one day down the track, and what you've just identified, Chris, it's a logical thing. It's a very logical program that you could apply to anyone. And you'd have to work out how to apply it to, say, to the Pacific Islanders or the African kids or whatever. But that would be, you know, we would consider that seriously. We have spoken to the Prime Minister about it. That would only be after we've actually concluded what the job at hand needs to be done. And we've got 9,000 boys across Australia, and we're probably about 7,000 or 8,000 short. We've got a scalable model, so we need to crack on and finish the job at hand. And when we've got that in hand, we'll definitely talk to whatever governments want to look at other things.
Jared, we held our breath collectively when COVID hit and schools were shut down, particularly those involved in CLONTARF, for fear that, frankly, a bunch of our kids were going to be sent home to less functional homes where there mightn't be laptops and computers, where in some cases there mightn't be parents that weren't valuing education, and where there probably wasn't much access to Wi-Fi. I know there was great fear that years and years of work could be lost as kids disengaged again. Little Birdie tells me it's been much the stickiness of the program, the loyalty the kids have of the program has overcome a lot of that, and it's looking pretty good at the back end as kids re-engaged in school.
What we did when COVID hit, we just quickly bunkered down and sort of thought through the eyes of our boys, which we do most of the time. And we realised they were going to go back into a much more dysfunctional space. There was a lot more money pushed into the unemployment space, and so a lot of our young fellas were going to be more at risk. So we went the other way. We stayed on the park. We convinced governments to allow us to keep our academy rooms open across Australia so our men could stay involved. Our boys could come to a safe space. We got our fellows to drive around town, deliver food, deliver homework. So we went very, very hard at right across Australia at staying involved in our boys during this risky time. And we did see some bad behaviour. There was certain things happen. But what we have found, because we measure everything we do, we've had in New South Wales 99.1% of the boys who were disengaged because of COVID have returned to school.
Wow, that 99 plus
0.1%. In Western Australia, I didn't get it. We had 2,001 boys in WA and 1,997 boys are back at school.
That's remarkable.
So staying in their life and having that relationship's allowed us to get them back into the school. We feel for the boys who don't have a program and who probably further disengaged. And as someone pointed out today, if you're at the bottom of the pecking order to get a job, you're way down the pecking order now. This COVID's really impacted that.
So there's 200 people still out there listening to us at the moment, and there's plenty of others going to see it on recording online later, including Mark Scott I'm interviewing and a bunch of corporates. What can educators and corporate sector do to get involved and back a program with all the best will in the world? Is an Indigenous program that really works. That's what I love about it, success. What can the rest of them do to get involved, to give you a hand in mentoring and sponsoring? What's possible?
I think, first of all, to understand how we fund ourselves is important. And we fund ourselves a third federal, a third state or territory, and a third private. All of those are partnerships. All those groups are very highly valued. We work with all of them day to day, and they're wonderful. What happens with the private sector, it allows us, once we get in a partnership with them, to find out where their jobs are, who their managers are in Chifley or, in Parramatta, so we can introduce our boys to their managers. We can start to get them a real physical contact. We place our boys into workforce at the end of their schooling. So this year we've got 850 boys in year 12. 85% of them were placed in a job or further study within 6 months. Really, the first thing that people who may be interested in looking at what we do was actually come and have a look, see what we do, be educated about it, get some education about the issues that confront these kids and what the outcomes we get. And then from there, they can take it forward. We're really, we're a slow burn. We like to have
that. I took 10 staff from our office at Chifley College. It's the best day we've ever done as a group. Humbling, educational, and we've maintained a contact with those kids with the program. I would strongly endorse that. If you reach out, I think they can find you on the website, or Brendan Marr, who's your dynamo of New South Wales, or track me down. We'll put you in touch. We're very proud to be a partner of CLONTARF. As I said, it's a remarkable program. My only frustration is how we roll it even further. More schools, more communities, more genders, because it finally is a program. And I must say, it's not only the sport. What I saw in that homeroom, it's the respect they're given by your staff who work with those guys. The homeroom is probably more important than the chance to play footy on the weekends. And it really...
Footy's just a lure, Christopher. I mean, all the studies say the most critical thing that you should exit school with is a high level of emotional intelligence. Everything after that is a bonus. And if you've got a high level of emotional intelligence, you'll get a job, you'll maintain your job, you'll be able to fit in with the team, etc., etc. So that's really the part we try and play with our boys, and I think you've witnessed it. But it's been wonderful. It's quite incredible for me as a West Australian, come from Fremantle, a little port city on the other side of Australia, to be immersed in the greater Western Sydney area, see the size and the dynamic nature of it and the potential of it, and to have a little part to play. And we're really thankful for the advocacy we've had from everyone, in New South Wales. Yourself, of course, Gus Gould, but, Gladys and all her team, Mike Baird when he was there. We've had, Barry O'Farrell. We've had great support.
I know the PM is personally a big supporter of...
he's got a program in Cronulla down at Endeavour, and so he's been, owned that program for probably 8 or 9 years. Can I say this? Our year 7s that we started with in 5 years ago are now in year 11. This is to put a number on it. So we started with 49 boys and we've got 48 in year 11.
Wow.
And what happens is they, across Australia, there's been a less than 5% retention in schools of these boys, and we hit a 90+% retention. So we anticipate having 48 boys in year 12. Across Greater Western Sydney, we'll have about 70 boys in year 12, and that'll just climb, and every year that'll punch out.
That's fantastic, Jared. Well, in closing, as I said, we're delighted about our partnership. Anybody wants to get involved, contact me. We'll put you in touch with the team, because it's been remarkably successful. You did probably, when you mentioned the port city of Fremantle, that in a segue with the great Lebanese community of Western Sydney, and I wanted to take the chance to acknowledge the port city of Beirut, which has had a pretty awful days too, and we have a huge, particularly Maronite community in Dundas, where I grew up, which have had a bad spot recently for other reasons. So our hearts go out to our brethren in Beirut. But to the port city of Fremantle, Jared, thank you for spreading your joy west to east. And we're delighted that rugby league's been so much more successful than AFL in engaging kids. And
well, funny enough you say that, but the two sports, Aussie Rules and Rugby League, have done a phenomenal job in the Aboriginal space. That's why they have a huge relationship. And it's the reason why we use Rugby League in New South Wales and Queensland, because of the great job it's done. Can I leave you with this, because this has been really pertinent to where we think the whole thing goes, is that in 2002 we had one academy and we had 15 boys finish year 12. So we thought that's all we're going to do, not 130 odd now. And we had those boys back this year before COVID, and 11 of the 15 earned 90,000 plus, 9 of the 15 earned 120 plus, and 14 of the 15 said they've always been in a job, and one responded that nearly always. 5 run their own businesses. 9 of the 15 currently own their own home. 1 of the 9 owns multiple homes. 5 of the 9 have a home worth more than $500,000. All 15 have purchased their own cars. Family, 8 of the 15 are married and 1's divorced. The other 6 are all in de facto relationships. 15 of the 15 have children, 55 children altogether. 14 of the 15 responded all their children go to school between 80 and 100% of the time. And the other one went, well, my kids can't go, they're too young. So
as Paul would say, that's a beautiful set of numbers.
That's a generational change that we want in Greater Western Sydney 20 or 30 years down the track.
We sure do too. We'll keep backing you in to help achieve that. Jared, thank you very much for your time, sir. Thanks for the work of you and Brendan and all the team, particularly the young blokes in the rooms who are working so closely with those students. So congratulations, and we'll keep digital equity in mind too, because it's a genuine advantage issue. So thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks, Christopher, so much for your advocacy, mate.
Go the Eels, well and truly. I'll pass back over to my Executive Director, Dr. Adam Leto now. He'll appear on screen any second, and I'll just keep you amused in the meantime. But I repeat, if people want to get involved with either the Public Education Foundation to sponsor some young kids and mentor some young kids through high schools in Western Sydney, or get involved in CLONTARF, or the Bankstown Poetry Slam, or Blue Datto, which teaches kids to be safe in cars in the West, any of these programs, the Story Factory at Parramatta, a range of Kimberwali up there at the old Wayland High, any of the ways we can broker people into those programs that we support, we'll put up on the website and encourage you all if we can. To the bloke who runs most of those programs, I'll hand over. All yours, Adam.
Thanks, CB. Next, I've got the pleasure of facilitating this next panel discussion, which is broadly framed around the jobs of tomorrow and how our regions are positioned to respond to some of these emerging industry opportunities. One of the nice things I think about this panel is that all of our speakers have a ground level perspective on some of the issues we want to unpack. So they're all coming up on screen now, but I have to say in advance, Lil Gordon, who was originally slated for this session, has been a last minute withdrawal. So she sends her apologies, but she has pushed forward one of her esteemed colleagues, Renee Thompson, who you heard from earlier, who's the Partnerships Officer at Kimberwali and is also the Deputy Chair of the Darebin Land Council. Thanks for stepping in at the last minute, Renee. Just as a brief background to the guys that are here, we've got Helen Hamilton-James, from Deloitte, Western Sydney. Thanks, Helen. And Ramin Malik, also one of our Gen West participants, and also a chemical engineering and law student at University of Sydney, amongst a range of other titles, which I won't go through. She's basically doing a lot of things across a lot of different platforms. So welcome, Ramin. And Scott Langford, last but not least, the CEO of SGCH, one of the nation's leading community housing providers. Welcome, guys. Thanks for your time this morning. I'll jump straight into it. And a lot of this builds on the conversations that we've heard from earlier this morning around education, skills, knowledge, training. The very clear message from a lot of people at the moment, not just government, but across the board, is on jobs. Now, without being too alarmist, based on previous national economic downturns, which we're going through at the moment, and I won't use the R word, but most people are aware that we're in the middle of a recession. Western Sydney hasn't traditionally fared well during these periods, and GFC aside, if you look back to the last big recession in the 1990s, the Western Sydney impact was almost double what we saw nationally. So in places like, particularly in southwest Sydney, we've got Liverpool, Bankstown, Campbelltown, the rates of unemployment were somewhere in the 20 to 25% bracket, which is a lot higher than what it's been historically since then. Given that Western Sydney is home to a lot of disadvantaged communities, what do we need to be doing now in terms of policy support, the projects, the initiatives that government, private sector should be taking? What can we be doing to ensure that the communities in these areas are protected and have access to the opportunities to improve their circumstances? I might start with Scott, and maybe Renee, Ramin, Helen can jump in afterwards. But Scott in particular, you're at the coalface of some of these communities. What are you seeing, feeling, and what should we be doing to protect these guys against further damage?
That's a really big question, Adam, and I'm sure others on the panel will be able to add a lot more colour than I will. I think firstly we should recognise that the people of Western Sydney are incredible. There's a level of resilience that I think is a real advantage for the region, and that applies right across the socio-economic spectrum. But I think that what is really challenging at the moment is that a lot of the industries that have offered employment pathways for a lot of people in the community in Western Sydney are challenged: hospitality, retail, and construction. I think we would say we're very fortunate we're not in the position that Victoria's in at the moment, but a lot of these are also jobs that can't be done from home. And so in the short term, I think it starts with a recognition that there are these added challenges, and certainly a lot of the households that we support through the provision of affordable housing, we've seen a significant number of those applying for hardship relief in their rent, which we're obviously granting to them because they've had their incomes cut. And for households in social housing, I think it's a particularly challenging time as well, because they're faced with the added challenges of perhaps not being as connected, having access to internet. We've heard a lot about the equity access issues. So I think some short-term interventions to get better connectivity into communities in Western Sydney is a really an urgent burning platform right now. And then we can talk about what that means in the medium term. But right now, behind closed doors in Western Sydney in social housing are households that are stepping further away from the opportunities that education and the pathways towards employment that were there 6 or 12 months ago, and at the moment feel further away than they ever have.
Renee, what's your view? You're dealing with a lot of sort of Indigenous youth through Kimberwali. What's the sentiment, the mood like from the kids coming through? Is it all doom and gloom? Are there some signs, some positive signs that you're seeing emerge?
Yeah, Adam, I think that's important to point out is echoing what Scott has said, is that our people know that we are a resilient people, and I think that's first and foremost important to speak to. And looking at Western Sydney, it's no secret that we are the largest population of Aboriginal people across Australia, and to really look at how we can leverage investment as a recovery tool to create that economic parity across our community. I think if we do that right, we can create generational wealth for our family and communities. And in regards to young people coming through Kimberwali, it's not doom and gloom. I think we're in a really unique space and time at the moment to be able to create that systemic change. We have our foundational partners with Microsoft, with LinkedIn, with Western Sydney University. And the important thing about Kimberwali is that we don't do things to people, we do things with our community. So we ensure that we always reflect on what community needs, what their aspirations are, and how we act as that connector and facilitator between our young Aboriginal people coming through the centre and ensuring that we're able to provide services. So short answer, no, it's not all doom and gloom, and we take this opportunity as a unique one to really push and leverage these opportunities that will come our way.
And just on those opportunities, Ramin, what do you think some of those opportunities are? I mean, there's been a lot spoken about using this time as a way of disrupting and changing the way we do things. Do you have a view? You're on mute.
Yeah, definitely. I think what the opportunity here is right now to think about how we're delivering education in the first place. And I don't think that's necessarily tertiary education, but for example, a lot of people in Western Sydney, women from migrant communities, I know a lot of them who used to go to local schools and do mini courses and things like that and build that sense of community, are now finding places online. So those programs are shifting online, those children's groups, those business groups, all of those things are all shifting online. So I think that's really, really important. And I think what we also need to do is take people along for the ride who might not necessarily be part of those traditional education systems. So, for example, in my own household, we're pivoting to running a business online. So my dad's learning how to use eBay. He's learning how to take photos on his phone and do all of that. And it's a really, really scary kind of, stepping stone for a lot of people who just even haven't confronted technology before. So I think it's really important to also get those basics down pat, those people that are falling through the cracks, what can we really do to just mobilize them in their homes? Because a lot of people just don't have that access yet.
Yeah. Helen, the jobs narrative, the message that's coming out at the moment is not a new one for Western Sydney. As Christopher touched on earlier, through shaping future cities that Deloitte put out, you flagged years ago the need for 200,000 new jobs in Western Sydney within the next 10 years. Our economy has benefited from waves of immigration and infrastructure investment. So the two main pillars of economic growth have been centred on those two areas. In a post-COVID world where we're going to see probably some changes to population and perhaps even construction, what are some of the risks in terms of exposure that that's facing Western Sydney at the moment? And as we look to the other side, flip side to that, what are the opportunities then to help the Western Sydney bounce back post-COVID?
I think, thanks, Adam. I think the other panelists have sort of talked about the risks a little bit. So if I can flip it onto the positives, I think, there's been a lot of conversation on this session and the earlier sessions around agility and the ability to be flexible. I think that the importance of a base level of knowledge for everyone. We've talked about, having technological equity. I think that's important. Digital equity is important. I think Western Sydney is actually in a good place in many cases as well. We've got so much infrastructure investment coming into the region. And if we think about the precincts that we talked about earlier, jobs in health, education, and construction of those precincts and the larger construction projects, not residential so much, but the larger construction projects supported by the government spend, I think there will be jobs in that space. So I think it's making sure that we've got the ability for people to flex. Retraining is really, really important. The ability to take the skills that people have got from other roles. Maybe they've been working in a restaurant or somewhere in a business that's now closed down, a tourism business that's closed or is closing down. So they need to, again, using the word pivot, they need to pivot. And I think that ability to refocus is going to be what gets Western Sydney through this. And from the discussions earlier, we've got the people thinking about collaboration and that retraining micro-credentialing to allow us to do that and be in a good position.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think it's one that Scott mentioned earlier around there is an abundance of talent and skills and knowledge that exists in the area. One that we've seen, I think, over the last decade, the number of tertiary students grow or double in just 10 years. So the biggest challenge, it seems, is the jobs meeting that demand. So we're seeing 300,000 people every day move out of Western Sydney to the city to access jobs and employment opportunities. Now with COVID, and we're seeing it now, we've seen it a lot, that there's been a lot of discussion around the workplace of the future, that it might not require travel. Now, I want to throw to Ramin here, because I know someone who is required to spend probably hours commuting for study, for work. Is that one of the things that you're looking for, that one of the legacies of COVID will be a shift in the way we commute, and that might have an impact on the jobs deficit in Western Sydney, that we won't be travelling to the city anymore to access these same opportunities? Is that your hope, and is that a realistic expectation?
Yeah, I think it's been, a really interesting shift to online. Obviously, everybody's seen that the hours in the day are much more accessible right now. And I think that's really great in terms of just cutting down that social inequity that exists. Quite often, being from Western Sydney, I wouldn't be able to access every single social event because, who's bothered jumping on the train for 45 minutes to get to uni? And so I think it's great that we're pivoting online. But one thing that I've noticed is that the opportunity for social connection and meeting people, I think that's where that strain is, and I think that there could be more opportunity around that. Additionally, I think it's really important to recognize the fact that not every household environment is, equipped to have people within the home, to have that quiet, to have that calm. I know that I've always kind of looked outwards to outward places to, getting out of the environment in the home, which is really loud and, just happening everywhere, to find those quiet environments. So I think it'll be much more of a hybrid mix. I can definitely, for example, see myself, let's say, going to a campus in Western Sydney for my uni and then, dialing in with the students in the campus at Central City. So I think, there's an opportunity to build that hybrid. And I think that this pandemic, more than anything, has taught us the importance of just human connection, social connection, being in a room and talking together. So I think it's important that we don't lose that either, because, I'm stuck in this little screen in Zoom, but everything happening around me, you can't see. So I think it's really important that we build that hybrid model going to the future.
You're right, and I think you're spot on in terms of the tyranny of distance that many Western Sydney residents and commuters face every day might be resolved, hopefully through COVID at the back end, but it might be also setting up another issue in terms of digital inequity for those that don't have that same opportunity or same access electronically or online. How do we resolve that? Is there a view on what's required? I mean, Greg earlier mentioned the point about free online access. I think there was a point in the chat earlier about free Wi-Fi for students on buses. Probably not, going to be a holistic approach, but what's the view on sort of how we can address some of those things? And Renee, in particular, knowing that there are numerous resources out there for those that don't have at-home access, like libraries, like your centre. Should we be looking for more support for those sort of infrastructure for councils, for Kimberwali, for other initiatives that can provide an outlet for kids that don't have internet at home?
Sorry, was that Adam? Was that to me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we do. That's something that we do need to be mindful of. That's certainly been one of our barriers at Kimberwali. I wouldn't say barrier, but something that we're trying to work around is that how do we ensure that we've had to now move into this virtual way of living and learning? How do we equip our community members to be able to ensure that they've got access to technology, they've got access to the devices that they need to be able to participate in our courses, whether that's government looking at ensuring that we bring in more towers to ensure that, there's accessibility to Wi-Fi and to strong internet connections across Western Sydney. I know personally, my cousin lives in Bidwell and you don't get any reception there. And I think that's where we actually can create that divide between learning outcomes for our community members rather than, people in other regions across Sydney. So I think it's an important point that we raised, that we need to look at how we create that parity between connection and disconnection.
Adam, I just want to comment on that. I mean, I think that this is fundamentally challenging the notion of how we use spaces, both private and public. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in that to pick up on Ramin's point, I think for a lot of households, it's putting a lot of pressure on private space and how that private space is used. And I think that is a challenge for lower income households who don't have the options to just go and get a larger house or can't have exclusive use of bigger spaces perhaps all the time. So it is perhaps thinking about, well, where do you locate social and affordable housing in proximity to high quality public spaces? And where can they be the catalyst? So around some of these innovation precincts, around the shopping centre of the future, and what those spaces mean. How do you build in accessibility so that people can access, the internet? They can go. There are spaces that people can go and study. In Bonnyrigg, a community that we serve and look after the public housing on behalf of the New South Wales government. The youth council there's had access to dedicated space in one of our facilities. That's incredibly important as a means of social interaction, but increasingly will become important too, I think, in terms of access to some of these other things that many of us take for granted.
Yeah, I mean, and on the topic of disruption, Scott, you'd have to be fairly buoyed by the government's recent interest and investment in trying to support the development of social and affordable housing sector. Question to you and the rest of the panel: what are some of the other stimulatory measures that you'd like to see the government look at in terms of providing not just an economic stimulant but a social or environmental outcome? Are there any particular areas or things that you'd like to see the government introduce? Helen, I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Adam. I think there's a couple of areas that we need to focus on. I mean, one of the challenges I mentioned earlier, significant government infrastructure spend. I think one of the challenges from the current economic situation is private businesses are not investing. So we need government stimulus into the private sector as well to make sure that the private sector has confidence to be able to invest, and that could be through tax benefits, R&D incentives. There's a variety of mechanisms. So I think that's something that needs to be thought about to ensure that the private sector grows and can build back up the jobs that we're losing through the current times. And I think the other one that's important is let's use this as an opportunity to make sure that we think about sustainability. So we're fast tracking some projects through, but let's not use this as an opportunity to shortcut on that. Let's make sure that we build into that requirements that we're actually, environmental standards of, top environmental standards are being brought in and required. So with things like, waste management, water recycling, etc. I think it's an important opportunity for us to do that. And out of that will come opportunities for businesses as well. So I think those are the two areas that I wanted to raise.
Yeah. I've noticed Christopher's joined us. He's been keeping an eye on what's been happening in the chat room, and he's probably got a few questions to throw. But before I throw to him, just one last one that I'd like to ask all of you, and it touches on a lot of the conversation that was heard earlier through both Greg Whitby and some of the things that the Professor Peter Shergold mentioned as well. There's a lot of sort of focus and a lot of industry focus around new sectors, things like advanced manufacturing, robotics. We hear a lot about, the 3 Rs, which the government's sort of been heavily emphasised as part of the response to the Masters Review, the coding, the computing, all of these essential skills that they see are going to be needed and important in terms of allowing our students to get the next generation of jobs. Without downplaying the importance of those skills, though, and a few of the earlier panelists mentioned this, the softer skills, the communication, the creative thinking, the critical thinking, the empathy. Should the aim not be just to ensure students are job ready, but life ready? So to be able to be more socially, culturally aware, to hold a conversation with a stranger at the pub as well as being able to produce a 10,000-word thesis, to be able to manage their budgets and open a bank account, making kids life ready. Is that an aspiration? Is that a realistic aspiration? Is that what we should be aiming towards? Renee, I'll let you start off the conversation. And maybe Christopher's got a couple of kids.
And survive relationship breakdowns, that resilience as well, which is really important, doing youth suicide rates across Western Sydney. So, I'll just add that into Adam's question.
Yeah. Your thoughts on that?
I'll go first, Ramin. I think it's important that we actually look at what hasn't worked well, and we reflect on where we've come to, how we've gotten to this point, and then how we can change some of those measures. And I suppose the methodology behind our progression within Western Sydney. I think the importance is forming relationships and partnering and consulting with Aboriginal people and community is the only way to truly be able to respond to this need. And I feel that Aboriginal voices, we need it included, and we need it to be joint and be complementary policy solutions that address community identified social and economic needs to be able to create the solutions we need for Western Sydney. That's sort of my point.
Yeah, well said. Ramin.
Yeah, I think, as someone who's gone through tertiary education, both in the engineering and the humanities front, there's kind of that disconnect that exists between education and the real world. And I think, that education sector also needs to reflect on how we can just integrate those skills into the way that we teach and we learn. And on top of that, I think, young people just kind of go through the education system without really learning those life skills in any particular way. And I think this is where, as Renee mentioned, community groups are really, really important. So how are we engaging with young people, from different cultural backgrounds, people whose families have never really thought about super, have never really thought about taxation, have never really thought about what investment and savings means. And if you're the first in your family to do that, what is that financial literacy that's out there? And I think there are programs that are out there. You're seeing programs such as Money Girl, which is looking at empowering women in financial literacy. So I think it's about embedding that within the education system. So how can schools partner up with those smaller organizations to really deliver that? And I think it's really about that partnership that you're building between both community and education.
Yeah,
I think if ever you wanted to have a hope for the future, the two most articulate, talented, resourceful young women from Western Sydney on this panel ought to give you that hope. Can I go to the other two? The question for Helen and Scott, you're the employers of these people. Just quickly, we're going to go to Mark Scott in a moment. When you're looking at people to join your staff at St George Community Housing or Deloitte, what do you say to yourself about what's not being taught at school, TAFE or uni that you need an employee? Or what is the role then? Does it fall to the employer to round out that whole education? Or is there that frustration that they should be turning up with a degree or a diploma in something that is not currently being offered?
Maybe I can go first on that, Chris. So as an employer of over 450 staff in Western Sydney, we do have a real vested interest in getting people that are job ready. And back to the earlier question, a job is no different from life. So it's those life skills that you learn. And we can train someone in a technical area, but someone needs to have those softer skills. They need to be able to work in teams, be creative thinkers, be confident, be able to have a conversation. All those softer skills that we've talked about through this session, they are so critical. And I do have to say, I think they are lacking in some areas. They're not as strong as I think you would hope they would be for some of our people coming through. So I do think there's a lot of work still needed around the education process. And again, let's not focus so much on the technical, which people need, but business can start to train that, I think. It's more those softer skills, those life skills that are really critical. You need people that can talk to clients, can work in teams, solve complex problems. So for us, it's definitely, that there's an element of change needed. And also, from our perspective, it's not we get someone and they're ready to go and they're not going to learn anything more. It's this concept of a lifetime of learning is critical. And certainly at Deloitte and a lot of other businesses, training and development happens all the way through someone's career, and that's critical.
Where are you being let down by the education providers, or where could you step in and round it out?
Chris, I think I'd echo those sentiments. I think it's about the interpersonal skills, and I don't know if it's being let down by the system, but I think it's the emphasis on the importance of that human-to-human interaction is the basis for everything. And I think we at times prioritise hard skills too much. I think we use a very substantial amount of public resource and work with the likes of the Lend-Leases of the world to deliver this bricks and mortar thing we call housing. But at the end of the day, it's a human service. It's about a means to an end. And I need people that know how to interact with people, because that comes from relationships and working on building trust, and that's what gets outcomes. And I think it's a particularly interesting time where we've got everyone talking about where the future of the education system going, the federal government de-emphasising some areas of qualifications like social work that perhaps are going to be needed more than ever, those skills and that human-to-human interaction.
Scott, I see the boss of Lendlease building just said thanks for the shout-out, so you're a proud partner of some
I assume that he'll waive his next vary on the basis that I've mentioned that. Very kind of him.
I'm sure it will. A company started by Dick Dusseldorf, one of the great industry training icons of the world. To Renee and Ramin, going back to the comments that have been, Renee, you'll be delighted to know there's lots of people saying, how can you stretch not only Clontarf beyond, but how do you stretch Kimberwali to the southwest, physically the old Wayland High? And Ramin, a lot of people talking about, good on you for talking about the broader soft skills required, even the superannuation withdrawals, that issue. Can I take the last question, the other questions that are back to you two? Looking at your more recent education or current education you're going through, what would you think, and just as we're joined by the Secretary of Department of Education, so the perfect timing, what would you, looking back, have said you would have had added to your formal education around you now as you're starting careers outside the classroom?
I'll get started on this one this time. Well, I've kind of been going through the recruitment process right now, applying for graduate jobs and things like that. And one thing that I hear quite a lot right at the end is, oh my God, you know how to string a sentence together. And for me, that's outlandish to think that that's not normal. And I think that's something that's really, really important. For example, when you're going through an insulated degree program, whether, for me, it's been the engineering and the law, they're very, very insulated in the skills that they teach. So yes, I know how to code, but a lot of people don't get that experience of communicating with others. And the way that I've developed, that experience in communicating with others has been outside of the educational environment. So, as many migrant kids know, you're the interpreter for your parents, from the age of 5 years old, and you deal with the outside world. From being part of these organizations such as the Bankstown Poetry Slam, talking to people and communicating through that adversity, I think has been a really important life experience for me in building those skills. But yeah, going back to the point of it being a soft skill, I think that needs to be removed from the label, and it's just really a life skill. You need to know how to do these things. And well, I think my challenge to the recruitment sector would be, how are you actually recruiting people? If you're looking at that resume and if you're looking at the marks that I have, those aren't really a reflection of who I am. The adversity that I've gone through, the communication and the people that I've met are much more representative of that. And so is it really a question of, are the right people coming through, or are we just not capturing the right people? Because you can't really measure a soft skill by a mark or anything like that.
I fear to say the low marks I got were a true reflection of me. But very last word to Renee, because we're going to throw to Mark at the moment. It's Education Week, so he's a busy bugger. Renee, I'll unmute you, and just to wrap up there, you're working with other kids now at Kimberwali, delivering a unique form of education, extended education on site. Do you have hope for a rounding of the curriculum that'll better equip students, not only Aboriginal students, but all Westies for life beyond the classroom?
Yeah, Chris, I think I just have to echo what Ramin said, and I think it's really looking at those soft skills. To go back and think about my education, what I would have hoped to have is to feel that empowerment piece behind me. Like, we know that we are Aboriginal people, we're the most resilient people in the world, but to feel that support and to know that we have that self-belief instilled in us. That's what I would have loved to have had, is that extra support coming through. And I think further to Ramin's point, leveraging the opportunities that standalone services have. So we look at Kimberwali, that is what we hope to give to our young kids who come through this centre, is to be that extra support arm, to let them know that they are capable beyond belief and that they have that support behind them. So I do hope for a change in curriculum, and I think moving forward it would be great to see culture more embedded in our curriculums moving forward. That would be a good change for First Nations people.
Thank you to Renee and Ramin. Thank you to Scott and to Helen. I must say, Helen, particularly like your role as a mentor. You put some young Deloitte workers as part of our Generation West program too, and they've been a great addition, keeping Ramin and Renee honest. So it's a great little program. We're glad you've been involved, and Scott as well. And Adam, thank you for all your work in this session, bringing it through. I will have a try unclunky thank you very much, and introduce Mark Scott. the Secretary of Education in New South Wales, who I said during Education Week, he's a busy bugger, notwithstanding having been busy trying to restructure an entire education system, one of the biggest, in the Western world. When you think of it, in most parts of the world, different authorities run the public school system, but in New South Wales, it's a huge system, and the way in which he and his colleague Anthony Manning at schools infrastructure managed to quickly get online and to restructure the delivery of education services, Mark's been quite remarkable. So as we unmute you, and I'll throw you in the mix, we've had a great session. I know you've been busy with a great session this morning from TAFE, universities, high schools, external education and others to come through. You're sitting in Education Week in the middle of a pandemic, and we'll need to unmute you. There you go. How's it look in the, I used to say, we're starting to say post-COVID. Sadly, we're not yet post-COVID, but what's your instant reflections on the somewhat incredible journey of bushfires, plague, floods and pandemic?
Yeah.
Give you for the past 6 months.
Well, Chris, thanks for the opportunity and good to be able to join you today. I think it's a tribute to the incredible resilience of our school leaders and our school system that they've coped so well with the disruption of the year. At the beginning of the year, I think if you said to us what's going to be the defining feature of the year, it would have been recovery from drought and bushfires. Almost 200 schools affected. I was on the ground down the south coast at the very beginning of the year, and clearly traumatised schools, traumatised communities. But then, unprecedented is the cliche, of course, but COVID has hit. I think the transition our schools did to learning from home, the way our teachers pivoted in a matter of days to be able to deliver the school curriculum to students learning at home, to be able to reflect the diversity of environments that students would be learning in. I think they did a fantastic job. And I think as real an achievement was getting everyone back. When the Premier said best that people learn from home, already 40% of our kids were at home. And there was clearly uncertainty and apprehension about being in a school environment. The fact that we got so many students back, we had terrific attendance once we reopened the doors, and we've had a very successful second half of term 1 and the beginning of term 2 and beginning of term 3. I think that's a tribute. But we've learned a lot. We're not through it yet. We're continuing to monitor very carefully, and there are some real issues that we're dealing with today for schools in border communities down near Albury-Wodonga, up in the Tweed. But big collaborative effort, everyone working together, and I think we've done as well as we possibly could have under the circumstances.
During the session today, there's a few themes that have come through. One that got great applause, I think Greg Whitby suggesting that the class of cohort of 2020, there ought to be a free university and TAFE carriage through. That the trauma they've been through is something maybe legislators across the country could think about. I don't need you to offer it up today.
Well, it's beyond my pay scale, Chris, I could say. But look, the one thing I would say, we're very conscious of this, and I'm on the board of NESA. We run the HSC, and we're really conscious of this cohort of 2020. They've had a tough run, and our advice to them has been, you've just got to keep your head down and keep focused, try not to be distracted. I would say, and I respect Greg's view, of course, and he's a great educational leader, even if government wasn't to do that, it won't be a bad time to be trying to get into university in 2021, nor in TAFE. Universities are going to be clamouring for domestic enrolment given the collapse in the international market and the real challenges about getting students in. There will be more money.
Already. There's been some free TAFE short course in the marketplace.
And there will be additional TAFE. There's been lots of free TAFE courses, as you said, that have been offered. Enormous take-up of those, which I think is indicative of the strength of the TAFE brand and the confidence that people have in TAFE to be able to deliver training. But there will be more training courses made available invariably, given the challenge we know that school graduates are going to have in finding a job in this workplace, the reskilling requirements of a post-COVID environment. There will be more training opportunities as well. So you can make an argument that the class of 2020 have faced obstacles that none of us ever had to face, but they're also going to have some pretty good opportunities if they want to transition to future learning. 2021 won't be a bad year to do that, I suspect.
There's also issues, just for your background, with the great bit of news we heard, the CLONTARF cohort around the country of 99.2% back in the classroom, despite being sent. And that shows a stickiness and loyalty by the kids, that program, which is, you and I share a commitment with Indigenous issues, and that's just great news. We heard from Jared Neesham earlier today.
Yep.
A request for more soft skills to be taught in curricula for students to make both from the employers and students alike, saying we need probably less the old 3 R's or add an extra R for resilience.
Yeah.
More intuitive learning, and lastly, a bigger offer for the private sector. Years ago, the complaint was McDonald's was sponsoring things in schools. Now it appears to be not only maybe Anthony Manning doing PPPs with schools eventually, but a broader offer for the private sector earlier on in high school education to be part of that pathway transition that Peter Shergold's been talking about as well.
And I think I know you've had Peter on earlier. I mean, I think Peter's going to be a very influential figure here in New South Wales education. He's been an influential figure in Australian public service for decades now, but chair of NESA, a paper that's with national education ministers now around vocational education in schools. The work he's doing with David Gonski, looking more broadly at vocational education and TAFE here in New South Wales. And I'd have said,
and his minor role at Western Sydney Uni,
and of course they're all the new ones on top of Chancellor of Western Sydney Uni. So he's very influential, and I think he brings to it, public sector experience also, including running the federal department. But he's put a laser-like focus on vocational education in schools, and we know that we need to do better there. We know we need to be working better in partnership. Already the government under Jeff Lee has committed to 20 new programs that will be developed by TAFE on offer to school students using remote learning. That's a vocational education program that's underway. We're making investments in schools like Seven Hills to think through what the physical environment to support vocational ed should be. And
Meadowbank must be a good example for you that combines school and TAFE.
Yeah.
Meadowbank, Super TAFE.
Yeah, and I think the Meadowbank development, school and TAFE side by side, tremendous opportunities there. And I've been talking with Stefan Falby, who is the new managing director of TAFE.
He was on this morning as well.
I think there are great opportunities for us to be working side by side here. I think I've said to you in previous conversations, Chris, I think this is one of the sobering stories of Australian education and New South Wales education. The first HSC class was 1967. That came off a report written by one of my predecessors many ways back, Harold Wyndham. That report was written in 1959. What is striking is that the HSC is still so familiar in its look and in its structure to that first class in 1967. So people in their 70s did an exam system very similar to the ones that our 18-year-olds will be doing this year.
The year my high school, Cumberland High School opened, 1967.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, at that stage, only 20% of students were continuing on to do the HSC. Now it's closer to 80%, and we need a fuller range of programs available, better quality vocational ed. We need to recognise that some students will go from a vocational education stream to doing university. Some students who go to university are going to do vocational education. All these pathways are changing dramatically now, and we need a more flexible and collaborative schooling system to be able to meet the full range of needs of students. And we've got some great models that are emerging to deliver this in Western Sydney.
Maybe the only review that Peter Shergold hasn't done in recent times was the Masters Review, which has been the rigour in education. Some would say, though, the government's been great at taking up some of the options but left some of the other ones behind. Are you comfortable with where it is about the addressing things like critical thinking and other pathways?
Yeah, let's talk a bit about that. I came in on the back of some of your previous conversations, Raman and Renee and others talking about this. Look, I think a lot of this is captured in the Masters report and will be embraced by NESA, but I think it needs to be put in context. I think if you look at educational research around the world, there are a number of elements that need to come together. One is a mastery of literacy and numeracy at the early years of schools. I've heard it said, we learn to read so we can read to learn. And if we are going to create independent learners and lifelong learners, then mastery of literacy and numeracy at the beginning of school is the fundamental priority. And I think we all are in heated agreement around that. And that's why the Premier has said, let's start with K-2 and make sure we've got that right to get the foundation right. And then I think at times this curriculum debate can get into false dichotomies, actually. You do need knowledge. You need deep knowledge in subject areas, because that gives you the context where these general capabilities develop. Now, you and I could have a discussion about critical thinking and mathematics, Chris, but it would help if we knew a bit about mathematics. If we were going to have
I hope you do, because I'm not. I got less than 20%.
But I think that proves the point. I mean, if in fact we are going to be skilled at those softer skills, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, then the way that we are really going to be effective in those skills if we have deep knowledge in which they are embedded. And so critical thinking in history depends on a bit of knowledge and understanding in history, and critical thinking in the history context will be quite different to critical thinking in the sciences or in the mathematics. So you need both. And so I think you'll still have a strong discipline-based high school certificate and secondary school curriculum, but great opportunities to develop those skills that we know are valued by employers and will be very important for the careers of young people in things like critical thinking, collaboration and creativity and communication skills. We need it all come together in a curriculum, and that's what Masters has said.
Employer want to see in my students. Can we go? I mean, there's a lot of talk these days, putting COVID aside one moment, and even before that, curriculum reform, fancy new schools in the sky, etc. Let's go back to where education debate in public education in Western Sydney has been traditionally. Are our kids safe in the classroom? Are your teachers? I'm a father of a teacher doing education at the moment, and a 4-year-old in daycare, and a 20-year-old doing after-school care and studying at uni. Can we be safe as parents of teachers and students that they're safe in a classroom, that it's respectful? We had only an incident this week where, luckily, security jumped upon it, but a kid could have been a very horrible outcome with a rifle and a list of targets.
Good question.
Beyond disease, as the physical safety.
Let's talk about that. I think let's talk about it. It was interesting in the COVID context. One of the things we would say when we'd get the occasional COVID case in schools is that on any given day, nearly 1 in 5 citizens in New South Wales attends a school in New South Wales, government or non-government, as a student, as a teacher, as a member of the support staff. And so when you put it in that context, I can say to you today, Chris, that the single safest place for our children to be is in schools. Right. Given how many people are in schools, the number of incidents that we have are few and far between, mercifully. But we recognise we're operating in a complex society, and one of the things that I think we can see is anxiety levels are high, and I think that's exacerbated by the events of this year. We have serious incidents and prevalence of mental health issues, including with teenagers, which is a real focus for us. Well, and clearly through a social media environment, some children can be exposed to images and suggestion that can be quite harmful and damaging. So I think parents can be assured that schools are safe places. We take safety and security very carefully. We do work closely with the police and have former police staff who work with us here in the department. Security, safety, well-being of our staff and students is a top priority. But given how many people are in our schools each day, 1.3, 1.4 million people each day, we do remarkably well, and people should be reassured on that.
Your new schools, your shiny new school, be they vertical, horizontal, or other in between, largely being delivered by a very generous state government at the moment. Generosity be tested by COVID going forward, as were our hospitals. In earlier eras, ironically, under Labor governments, we went for PPPs for the schools. Under Liberal government, we've gone back to public financing of it. The world's in swings and roundabouts. Do you see an increasing role for the private sector, both in a curricular sense and also in helping you deliver the physicality of schools and TAFEs and others?
Let's take the infrastructure question first. I think I want to pay tribute to Anthony Manning and the team at School Infrastructure. I think they're doing an outstanding job. There have been 3 big tranches they're working on, the new and renovated schools. We've got a big air cooling program underway, and we've really been in every school working hard to eliminate that maintenance backlog. I think they've done an outstanding job. One of the things that you can see that we need to do is to continue to look at innovation in production techniques, so more modular schools, the ability to deliver big schools more quickly. These are things we're working on. And
the Mountable I grew up studying in.
No, very, very different. Even though, as you are testimony to, Chris, great education can take place in a demandable classroom, but modular schools are basically prefab schools that are built elsewhere, assembled on site. Fantastic quality. You wouldn't know how they've been constructed.
Happening in hotels around the world, rescheduled shipping, all sorts of things.
Yeah. So in a way, we're looking at innovative models, and I think it's fair to say, given the scale of work, some of the biggest and most innovative construction firms in the country are very keen to work with us. Look, I think we need to, on the curriculum issue, I think we need to have sensible and strong engagement with business and with the corporate sector. One of the things that Jeff Masters talks about in his report is more time for applied learning, more opportunities for students to be learning outside the school gates where that is possible. That's where we'd like to see vocational education go. But I think of an innovative principal like John Goh at Maryland's East. John Goh took his primary school kids off to Atlassian last year. He wanted them to understand what business was like, what the technology industry was like, what it was like to work in the city. And I think, a great example. And I think we need to know and understand that we are educating these young people in partnership with families and business and the broader community, that we need to tap into expertise when we don't have it within the school gates ourselves. And there are great opportunities for doing that. And we can do that within the curriculum frameworks and the governance frameworks that we have in our school system now.
A couple of questions online coming in. Firstly, are you being let down by universities in the quality of teachers they're delivering to you as an employer of those teachers, or standards of education?
It's a really good question. I think New South Wales has taken the lead around the country on this. We've been quite clear about requirements that we have as an employer, and I think this is where I think we've done well. We've muscled up. We are the biggest employer of new teachers in the country, and we've made it clear what our standards are. We've gone and looked at what the pattern and the pathway is for people to have a successful first 5 years in teaching. So we have our own requirements around ATAR, around university academic standards, around other things that we are looking for. I think, it's a whole separate conversation. I think there are real issues facing the higher education sector, but there's no doubt for a period of time, some of those universities just took in too many students with too low ATARs, which eroded confidence. And the government has urged there to be changing in those recruitment requirements for universities, but we're changing our recruitment requirements as an employer. And I think that's been a good policy initiative.
Who was your Mr. Keating? You're a fan of Dead Poets Society like I am. Who was the teacher you had coming through? For me, it was Perry Celestino, a American anthropology teacher at my high school in Western Sydney, who should have been a university professor but just wanted to teach kids about anthropology, which became the basis for the society and culture thing, which eventually was adopted as a HSC subject. Who was your teacher that inspired you to want a life in education, or changed up for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there was a teacher, David Brown. He was a science teacher I had at school, which is funny. I didn't go on to teach science, but it was just his great engagement with students, his ability to find a connection with students, to encourage us all and keep us all learning. I think there was a sense that we all knew each other. He knew us well and got the best out of it. But I would say Chris as well.
How do you produce more David Browns?
Well, I'd just say as well, I think I've learned most of all from my wife, who's principal of a school. And, it is that singular commitment to every child that you see with her. I feel that at times the weight, she runs a big school, the weight of every child, the well-being of every child, the commitment to every child is what I've learned from her. And I think that's what we see in our strategic plan in the department now, our commitment that every student is known, valued and cared for. That we're committed that every student is improving every year.
Voice at the front door of Punchbowl Boys High and saying good day in the morning and that type.
Yeah, I think it is that sense of every child, and I think particularly given the complexity of home environments, the complexity of the broader social environment, I think school is the anchor for many kids. If you go back, even when we were kids, Chris, but earlier than that, for many families there was a church or there were other kind of social groups that were around. Now, for many families, the school is the anchor for their lives and for their kids' lives.
Of not filling as much social civic gaps that it's
and so I've had good principals say this to me at times. You know, they recognise that school is the one safe anchor for their kids in a very stormy and unsteady world. And so it's that commitment to every child, to know every child. We you know, we have, you go into many schools now, you can, if you know where to look, you'll find data walls, and they are rooms that has every student's data information up on that wall, where they are tracking the progress of each individual student. And each of those students, you know, there are faces on that data. They know every kid. They know every kid. And one of the really interesting experiments we had a little while back, we heard about a school that was, that basically they asked the question, is every student in our school known, valued and cared for? And in the staff room, they put up a photograph of every child. And they said to the teachers, go and put a sticker next to the face of a child that you know and you know something about from outside your classroom. And what they were struck by was many kids were known by every teacher, but they found the kids who no one really knew. And then they developed a strategy to engage with those children. So to really know kids.
For the wrong reason.
Yeah. No, but to really know each child and where they are on their learning journey, to know where they are coming from, to know about their home environment, to be committed in that way, I think that's
why we're
powerful for success.
We're so committed to the CLONTARF program, so that on Supercharge, that version of.
Yeah, and I think we see it in a number of others too. I think we see it in Girls Academy. We see it in the work that Michael O'Loughlin and Adam Goods Foundation is doing. And one of the things I really should mention here, we have a clear commitment to significantly increase the number of Aboriginal students who complete Year 12 whilst holding on to a strong sense of cultural identity. And we're working closely with the Aboriginal Educational Consultative Group and other groups with real expertise in this. I mean, we have not served our Aboriginal students as well as we should have. That's part of our burden of responsibility, and we have a clear priority to do better in that area.
Question online, Mark, if we value teachers so much, why don't we value them a little more financially? Or why don't we differentially value them financially? Can we find a way? Why does Eddie Wu earn the same as a you know? And we've named the good teachers. We can also name the bad teachers. It's a fact of life.
Yeah.
How do you incentivize as a public sector employer? Is it possible for you to incentivize the good over the not as good?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, and I'm sure you understand that. I mean, in a way, what we want to do first and foremost is have a strong, you know, performance culture amongst our principals and amongst our school staff, that they know, as of course they are, they're accountable for seeing the improvement of students, and we're wanting to actually, and we've got a program underway to give far more data to schools around their performance so they can benchmark themselves around statistically similar schools, and they can monitor their progress over time. Every school now has targets for improvement in a way that they never have before, and these are targets that have been set between the schools and others in the department. So together we've agreed what improvement looks like. It's interesting, Chris. Yeah, you understand we've got so many teachers. It is challenging to be able to find that public sector money to pay teachers a lot more. When you talk with teachers, though, very few of them say they went into it for the money.
My son asked me to ask you. He wants to pay.
Very few of them went into it for the money, Chris. In fact, early on in people's careers, we've got, I think, the entry levels really quite a good level. In fact, many first-year teachers earn more than first-year lawyers and accountants and others. So in the early part of the career, I think we can attract people in. But few say to me that they are doing teaching because of the dollars. They're doing it for the intrinsic reward. And so I think what we can do is continue to ask the question, do we have the supporting infrastructure in place to allow teachers to do their best work? Are we getting rid of some of the unnecessary paperwork and bureaucracy? Are we giving them great professional development? Are we giving them great professional opportunities? And if they want to be leaders, and clearly more money will be paid to leaders in our system, are we providing them a supporting pathway so they can become leaders in our schools and have the support so that they can be successful leaders in our schools?
And I'm mindful that the flip side, when I was a kid, teachers got access to public housing. as essential
Yeah,
work.
and I think there is a housing question that we're conscious of. There are parts of Sydney now where it's hard to attract teachers, or it's harder to attract teachers because of housing costs and access, and that's something that is on our radar in metropolitan areas in a way that it hasn't needed to be in the past, and that's part of the challenge we have in building with working in a growing and expensive city like Sydney.
Two quick ones to wind up because the school bell's going to go for you in Education Week. I've got to ask one of the Lindy Dietz, the boss of Campbelltown City, wants to know about how we're addressing the shortage of industrial arts teachers, which I believe is a real baby boom bubble thing happening there.
Yeah, that's true. And more broadly on teacher shortages, we are doing a big piece of work on the pipeline that we need into teaching. Whenever we talk about school infrastructure around the department, I point out the fact that we are spending billions and billions and billions on new and renovating schools because we have about 160,000 additional students coming into the system over the next decade and a half. But who is going to teach those kids? I think we need to do more work on our recruitment, more work on our mid-career transition into teaching. And this is a big project we've got underway in New South Wales, and it's a national project as well.
So I'm a smart kid, did cooking at my school with 24 other girls and left the boys for the woodwork and metalwork. And last one was another question about, they talk about the IB program. Let me broaden it to the value system of private schools to attract and retain the middle class base in our public schools to sustain it. What do you take from the parents who want to have a greater involvement in their own school with their principal, values-based, whatever that means, or an IB curricular program? Is there flexibility in public education to drag them back rather than just doing more selective schools?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think so. We want every school to be a great school. We want every local school to be a great school. And that's why we're very clear around what our commitments are in the system to improvement everywhere. And we want to see that rise in standards flow through to every school, but also I think parents should be confident that every government school has a sense of values, that classroom management and discipline and self-discipline will be important attributes of every school, and we encourage engagement of parents with their schools and their school communities. On curriculum, on the IB, we've looked at that. But Jeff Masters looked carefully at that, and if you look carefully at the Masters review, you'll see some key elements of the IB that you could expect. We'll get some focus here from Nessa in current years. But yes, we want every school to be a great school. That is our focus, and that's what the reform program's all about.
Mark, thank you so much for your time. It's a busy education week. As you know, and we've discussed before, there's probably no greater foundation pillar to an advantaged Western Sydney than to have great public schools right across the region. There is a number of reviews. You've got a lot of papers and reviews to read coming your way, be it TAFE, be it high school integration, etc. So good luck and Godspeed in that. I think it's fitting that last year we closed the Out There conference at Bankstown with Eddie Wu talking about the great YouTube educator, and then 360, the wonderful high school band from Granville Boys High, and we still have our own rock star in the department to close up today. Thank you for your work and for recognising the fundamental role that education and schools have as both, and TAFE, particularly in your area now, have as a social and economic pillars in a region that desperately need it. So,
thanks, Chris. Thanks for your time. Thanks, everyone, this morning.
Thank you very much. We wrap up to everybody. Thanks to everybody for your time today, particularly to Anthony Manning and the team at School Infrastructure. We're so proud to have you as our partner in Out There, and to the others who've been always supportive, to all of our panellists, and to my remarkable team like we're managing behind the scenes, like Marushka Naranya sitting 2 foot from me right there, you can't see, who's pressing all sorts of buttons and waiting 3 minutes to go signs at me, to Brett Towers, who's got off his sick bed to manage technicals today, and to the team who've been filling the chat box and worked on this, and to my partner Adam Leto at the Dialogue for moderating it through. It's been marvellous. It's a hell of an education week, and I think it's a successful Out There, I hope, online. Most of what we're going to throw some stuff up, it'll be recorded online, I think, as of tomorrow, I promised. We'll throw up some of the other reports people have been speaking about through the day, and if it's possible, we'll come back and answer some more chat questions if they're relevant to us. Good day, good luck. I think the school bell is going, and we've all got to go and get some lunch. Cheers.